My name is Brian Bosch. I have had MG for officially diagnosed 2017. They think I've had it since about 2012, 2013, when a scan of my thymus gland came back enlarged.
We make antibodies against things to keep them out of our bodies, like viruses and bacteria, things from the outside. Sometimes we make an abnormal antibody to something on the inside, and that's what myasthenia gravis is. That is, it makes an antibody not against the nerve technically, not against the muscle technically, but it affects the chemical communication between the nerve and the muscle.
I was about 38 years old when I had just had a baby, and I was training for a triathlon for my 40th birthday. And as I was training, I noticed that my face was drooping, and it would recover overnight. And lo and behold, I went to my eye doctor, and she diagnosed me with this disease I'd never heard of.
You may have some drooping of an eyelid that comes and goes, double vision that comes and goes, or possibly when you're speaking, your speech may slur, or you may have trouble speaking for a long time.
I used to remodel houses. I used to do theater all over Kansas City. I was a salaried manager for Walmart, and it got to the point where I couldn't even, I could barely function. I could barely do my job anymore.
We provide all of our services for free. We put on a monthly clinic, and I remember very clearly going to my first free monthly clinic when I was newly diagnosed. It was nice to have a friendly face there that could answer my questions, provide me with handouts that I could then share with my family and friends about this new disease that I had. And we also provide monthly support groups so that those of us with the disease can talk to each other, share information, and share resources.
The Myasthenia Gravis Association is connected with a couple of myasthenia gravis specialty clinics here in Kansas City, one at St. Luke's Hospital and one at the University of Kansas Medical Center, and also associated with a myasthenia gravis clinic at St. Louis University in St. Louis.
They helped me to find Dr. Schwartzman, the doctor who knew what was going on. They have brought me in touch with the MG community, I'd like to say, around Kansas City, because I had no idea how many people were affected by it, how many people even knew about it. And I've been able to make some amazing friends.
I'm one of the neurologists that work in the Myasthenia Gravis Clinic at KU Medical Center. We all are very thrilled to be part of the Myasthenia Gravis Association activities. And it's been a tremendous partnership. We really get so much help for our patients with myasthenia gravis. We started a program where they actually come to our clinic and see almost every MG patient that we see in real time as we're seeing them. This just adds another very important layer to the healthcare management of our patients. And we think because of this, we have one of the best myasthenia gravis clinics in the country.
Being able to have the support of friends and family, I think, is the best thing that anyone with a debilitating disease could really ask for, is just their love and support and acceptance and just having them around.
Good morning. My name is Michael Egan, and I am the newly elected MGA Board Vice President. I want to welcome you to the 60th annual meeting of the MGA. We have an exciting virtual program for you, and I'd like to go through some of those details today. Before we begin, all the attendees that RSVP'd before October 29th should have received some type of swag packet in the mail. And feel free to follow along with the program that's in there. The program looks like this, and the agenda is on page 7 of the programming book. If for some reason you did not get the packet, just please email the MGA office and we'll send that out to you next week. The agenda, as I said, is on page 7 of the book, and we're going to start with some organizational and programming updates. You may recall that we hold our annual meeting late in the year, so we'll be reviewing not the current year, but rather the results from 2019. Our annual meeting affords us the opportunity to engage and interact with those in the industry. Today, we're fortunate to have 2 keynotes. Our first keynote is Sally King. Sally is a licensed clinical social worker. And our second keynote is Dr. Konstantin Pharmakidis, who is an associate professor of neurology at the University of Kansas. They're going to touch on 2 very important topics today: mental health and COVID-19. Sprinkled throughout our meeting, we'll be provided with various updates from several industry partners to provide updates on drug developments and service updates in the MG space. I would like to say a quick thanks to our sponsors today: argenx, ARJ Infusion Services, Catalyst, Alexion, Momenta, Immunovant, UCB, and Distinctive Meetings. Thank you all for your generous support with today's meeting. After we go through our keynotes and our industry experts, we're going to close out the meeting with 2 awards today. We have the Volunteer of the Year Award, and we also have the Stackhouse Award. The Stackhouse Award goes to someone who exemplifies the spirit of volunteerism and leadership, which is embodied in the philosophy of the Myasthenia Gravis Association. What I'd like to do now is invite Derek Haverkamp, who's the treasurer of MGA, to come up and share some updates on the MGA finances.
Good morning. My name is Derek Haverkamp. I serve as the treasurer for the MGA. As treasurer, I work with the board and with Allison Foss, the executive director, to monitor MGA's finances and ensure funds are available to meet our organization's mission and strategic vision. As winter approaches, we will begin to prepare our budget and financial goals for the upcoming year. Some of those goals are continue to increase income from foundations, corporations, individuals, and fundraising activities, seek independent grants from individuals, businesses, or foundations to cover our costs, increase income from annual benefit and events, work to increase the fundraising productivity of our board of directors, MGA members, and friends. Most MG associations throughout the country function as volunteers only and without office staff. Our board has chosen to see the big picture and the necessity to maintain structure, organization, including an office and staff. With nonprofit status comes our ability to seek grants from the United Way and other foundations that will help sustain staff, programming costs, and links to MG and community resources. Chris Cheney conducted our 2019 financial review. The report continues to reflect our compliance as a 501c3 nonprofit organization. I'd also like to thank our accountant, Carrie Gordon, for her dedication to our association and thoughtful working relationship with our executive director. A 2019 statement of activities and statement and changes in net assets follows on the following screen here. We'd like to thank the Yokota Foundation for their continued support. As outlined on the statement of activities and changes in net assets, our total revenues in 2019 were $246,578, and we had a total net income, a gain last year of $54,064. Once again, that's attributed to a lot of different sources, and our total revenues outlined on page 15. 35% of our total income does come from special events that are held, which include the 5K, which include the Walk in Wichita, our trivia night, and multiple other fundraising events. United Way in 2019 did fund 9.25% of our total revenue. Foundation contributions 24.76%. Full details on page 15. Our expenses are outlined on page 15 as well in the pie chart. 39% of our total expense does come from client assistance. A lot of that does come from office costs, paper, salaries, and administration's 10%, public awareness is 37%, and then fundraising is 12.85% total. That concludes my financial report, and I'll hand it back to Michael.
Thank you, Derek. I appreciate you going through that and appreciate all the efforts you put into helping us keep our books in line. At our board meeting this past week, we voted on the 2021 board members and officers, and I'd like to announce them right now. The president for next year will be LaDonna Diller, who unfortunately could not be here today, but LaDonna, I know you're watching and we miss you and hope to see you soon. I've been selected as the vice president of the association. Dr. John Sand will be the secretary, and Derek, who just spoke, will be the treasurer for 2021. Shown on your screen now are the other board members, and I'd like to introduce them. That is, we have Lisa Sakovich, John Wilkinson, Joe Bant, Brody Beck, Stephanie Hubers, Brett Henson, and Nancy Van Zant. These dedicated volunteers make it possible for the MGA to accomplish its mission and serve over 1,600 people a year. At this time, I'm going to invite our outstanding executive director, Allison Foss, up to the podium, and she's going to take it from here and talk about some of the other events that are going to take place today.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you all of you for joining today virtually. I think none of us could have anticipated that this would be how we would be meeting in 2020, but here we are. We're excited to be able to have our program today for all of our constituents across the region. We're also pleased today to be joined by several members of our Medical Advisory Committee, Dr. Veronica Hirstein, Dr. Mazen Damatsky, Mamatha Pasnor, Dr. Dayon, and Dr. Pharmakidis from the University of Kansas Medical Center. Also joining us today, Dr. Jafar Kafai, who runs the MG Clinic at St. Louis University. Thank you for being a part of our meeting. Many of our support group coordinators have also joined us today. We are so thankful for them, the whirlwind of 2020, helping us navigate and be flexible when we've had to make a lot of changes. Those joining us today, Carol Hunt, Larry and Dana Paxton, Sandy Gardner, Jan and Roger Huff, and Joni Jolliffe. Thank you. We're also extremely thankful for our generous sponsors who have made today possible. ARJ Infusion Services, Argenix, Catalyst, Alexion, Immunovant, Momenta, UCB, and Distinctive Meeting Group. I also want to say a big thank you to our staff who have really been behind the scenes, truly behind the scenes today, making everything possible. Tanya Renner, our Kansas City Program Coordinator, and Meredith O'Connor, our St. Louis Program Coordinator. They have, really worked hard to make 2020 accessible to everybody virtually and without being able to be physically present. So thank you. Also want to say a thank you to our board members for all their support and hard work. And lastly, thank you to ARJ Infusion Services for offering CEUs to nurses who are attending today. We hope you take time to read through our program and see what we've accomplished in 2019 and what's to come in 2021. A few housekeeping items we want to clear up as we begin today's programming. If you have any questions during our keynotes, feel free to use the chat feature. We will be monitoring the chat feature and communicating the questions to the speakers. You can also email the MGA if you have a question, and we will present that. Following today, a survey is going to be emailed to you, and we would love your feedback on our keynotes and the presentations. I want to say thank you to our patient and family partners for your continued financial support of our organization. In the coming weeks, you'll be receiving a 2021 membership information in the mail, and we invite you to join us. Thank you for being a part of our journey for the past 60 years. We hope you'll find today's programming resourceful and educational.
I just have a couple announcements that I want to just make sure we're all on the same page. And it's going to take us a couple of minutes to switch over and get our next speaker up. As I mentioned, if you did not get the packet, the email address that you can send to the office is info@mgakc.org. That's info@mgakc.org. And the office will send you out the packet, which will have the program and some other nice materials in there for you. Also, I just want to take this opportunity. Allison mentioned we never thought that we would be here at this time last year in this kind of a virtual setting. And also the support groups that have had to take place and the adjustments that people had to make over the last 6 to 9 months. It's just been incredible just how people have come together to just rally around what we're facing today. So I just want to thank everybody that's out there today. Thank you for your flexibility. Thanks for adjusting, because it's just so important to continue to provide support to people, but we had to do it in a way that was safe and we felt comfortable for everybody. So thank you all very much for working with us on that. So if we could just, we're going to just take a couple minutes to get some things, to get our slides set up, and we'll be coming back with Sally King, who will be talking about some things that I think you'll find really beneficial for us today.
We are excited to have Sally King joining us today to present Calm Through the Storm. Sally is a licensed clinical master social worker and crisis management specialist in Missouri and Kansas. She has worked in the field since 2001 with emergency mental health in adults. Sally has provided outreach, education, and project management on behalf of KU Alzheimer's Disease Center and the Landon Center on Aging. She specializes in older adult mental health, end-of-life social work, and lifestyle intervention coaching to decrease risk for depression at any age. Having spent many years training professionals in the area of mental health, Sally has received 3 Professional of the Year awards from her colleagues. I have had the opportunity to hear Sally present twice over the last 8 months, and I hope that you find her insight and knowledge as beneficial as I have. Sally?
All right. Well, thank you guys for having me. I appreciate the association for having me, and excited to spend some time with you this morning, sort of having a conversation of sorts about what does it mean to manage crisis? What does it mean to cope well when times are hard? We are all now sort of have a PhD, I think, in the coronavirus and a master's in the election, I guess, right? An ongoing master's. But so many of you probably are sort of getting used to this new normal of us, and especially with your diagnosis and those of the loved ones around you, this can be particularly challenging with the increased isolation. And I want to know that, I want to tell you that I want to be really sensitive to that today. And if nothing else, I hope you get normalized today about potentially maybe the situational depression or anticipatory grief that many of you may be having or struggling with. As they indicated, I am a clinical social worker here in Kansas City, Missouri, and I sort of straddle the state line here and do a lot of work on both sides, mostly in-home mental health therapy with older adults, folks that have Medicare, but I also do adult work as well, counseling. And with the virus, that sort of switched to Zoom for the most part, a little bit of outdoor counseling as well, or walking counseling, socially distanced. So But before I kind of got into this field, I spent a long time in community mental health, working with kind of the chronically mentally ill population. And the reason I share all of this is I just wanted you all to know that a lot of what I taught those populations that had like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or depression were classes like how to get through a crisis. Coping skills. In fact, I specialize in a mental health intervention called DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. It's a mouthful. So I'm gonna really kind of go through some of the nuts and bolts of DBT, because it's really very, very helpful for kind of all of us going through this real heightened time right now. Learned what it meant to be resilient, and how do people kind of get back on their feet after they've had a relapse or had a crisis in their life, right? What does it mean to be a good coper, to change the way you think about things through cognitive behavioral therapy, or to even change the way you look at happiness? One intervention that I really like is something called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, which was where we kind of change our relationship with cultural ideas that the goal in life is to be happy, or some of those things. So you'll be hearing me talk about some of these areas today in our time together. After I kind of got, if I'm full disclosure, after I got burned out in community mental health as a therapist, and I did group and individual therapy and a lot of mental health assessments and ER work, after hours mental health assessments and ERs, and I kind of transitioned into older adult mental health, and I really fell in love with working with kind of the older adult population, and spent some time in academia and at KU and Alzheimer's research, as well as for the state of Kansas, aging and mental health work. So I know I'm being a little repetitive of my lovely bio, but I just wanted to put a little traction to some of that so you'll understand maybe why I talk about the brain and even Alzheimer's prevention, and what does it mean to have a healthy brain. And so right now I just am part-time, and I do private practice with mostly older adults. And then I also do this nutty thing called yoga. And we might do a little bit of that today, or a little bit of the breathing today. But I spent many years getting trained in yoga, and I'm a yoga teacher. And so I teach online yoga for self-care, for social workers, nurses, older adults, anyone is just needing to learn what it means to be mindful through hard times. So if that's of interest to you, I'll be around a little bit after if you want to chat with me. There's a lot of us doing this stuff, so I hope you will consider a mindfulness practice after our time together. So as I sort of alluded already, situational depression, anticipatory grief is a real phenomenon going on right now. And I just want to tell you that if you're struggling, I have a 6 and an 8-year-old, and I work part-time. And so my kids have been home for 7 months. They literally, one just went back to a hybrid school schedule this week. So I have found myself, full disclosure, struggling with a lack of personal time, a lack of ability to have the self-care that I'm used to because of having my kids home all the time. So, this season has forced me to have some hard conversations with myself and my husband around our parenting, around follow through on parenting, around a lot of things. And I just want you to know that I've struggled. Most of my clients are struggling right now. And so if you are struggling to some degree, a flavor of anxiety, depression, I want you to tell you that us in mental health would say that you're very normal. And I just want to normalize that for you. Hopefully that feels good. One of the pieces that I really teach on a lot, and I do a lot of social work trainings out in the community, and one of the things that I work with clinical social workers who are social workers that are getting their clinical licensure. So we meet every week and for 2 years, and it's quite a kind of a relationship we build around building up their clinical skills. And one of the big conversations at the beginning of that clinical relationship with those social workers that I really talk a lot about is, what kind of social work career do you want? Now, many of you may not be social workers, but I think this will transition nicely into those of you that are caregivers, those of you that are in some capacity, caring for people that have some degree of woundedness, emotional, physical, diagnosis, whatever. If we're living or working in healthcare, a lot of us are vulnerable to this phenomenon called compassion fatigue. And this is kind of the natural result of spending kind of large quantities of time with people that have some sort of trauma or suffering. Now, remember, trauma doesn't have to be big T trauma like we think about, like with PTSD or those sorts of things. That sometimes trauma can be little T trauma, like loss of a job, coronavirus, stress at work, having a miscarriage or a death in your family, and there was no ceremony around that. There was no validation around that. There was no time or space to really grieve that, or presence of other people. That can be a little T trauma. Now, that doesn't land you in with a PTSD diagnosis, those little T traumas, but unvalidated pain is worrisome for those of us that are trained, and I'm a trauma-informed care trainer. And so one of the issues that we talk a lot about is this issue of compassion fatigue. And it's really a set of symptoms. And empathy, response to pain of others are key factors or players in that. And there's probably a really good reason that you are good at your job, or that you're a good caregiver, or that you're a great volunteer, or you're a good friend. It probably means you're an empath, which means you feel deeply. Raise your hand if you're one of those people. I am, right? So that's probably makes me a good therapist. The downside of being an empath or someone that feels deeply for people is that we can really get wounded. We can really get exhausted, biologically, psychologically, spiritually, socially exhausted when we are engaged in kind of darkness with people for long periods of time. And so one of the issues is we see with people that are vulnerable to this, and most social workers will come to terms with this. Most people in healthcare will come to terms with some degree of risk around this if you're not really engaged in rigorous self-care and good boundaries. I'm just going to say that out loud. So a lot of the causes of compassion fatigue, which is sort of on the trajectory on the way to burnout, and we can use the burnout term in caregiving. We can use the burnout term in professional caregiving, professional social workers, home, nurses, or just folks caring for other people long-term pretty intensely. So sometimes these things happen, not because we're at fault, but because maybe we were never taught how to take care of ourselves. Maybe we place others' needs above our own, right? Sometimes we've got our own past traumas, pain. We came from families where there were a lot of little T trauma or big T trauma. And so we were never really parented about what does it mean to validate that or parent ourselves and care for ourselves in a really compassionate way. Sometimes we don't have great boundaries. I mean, let's be honest. There's a lot of really great reasons to get in the field of social work or to get in the field of healthcare. And sometimes it's out of pain. I have a brother that has an addiction issue. That's why I got into the field, right? I mean, think about it. Your eye doctor probably has really thick glasses, right? So we've all got our own woundedness, our own reason that we get into the field. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes we use those things to work out our own, lack of a better word, our own shit. And that can lead to poor boundaries, inability to communicate our needs in a really healthy way. So one of the aspects of compassion fatigue, of getting kind of burned out with our own self-care deficit, is that we get into a response called fight or flight. Now, we've heard about this in the PTSD world, but a lot of us in the trauma world have really kind of gotten schooled in how does fight or flight show itself with people. Now, a lot of us think, oh, I don't have that. I don't have PTSD. But sometimes I think you will find yourself in much of this. Sometimes you will be in a season of avoidance. Does that sound familiar? In America, this is like our #1 coping skill. We just avoid our feelings. We numb ourselves with Netflix or podcasts or alcohol or vaping or shopping or Instagramming. I mean, figure out what your thing is. We've all got a vulnerability to this in our modern world, social media. And instead of feeling what we need to feel, it's real darn easy to avoid that. So that can be a real common one. Or sometimes we get angry, right? If I get activated, if I get triggered, if my kids are driving me bananas, and I feel like there's no end in sight for me to be able to have a time by myself, I will get aggressive. I never thought I was an aggressive person until I had children. Or we disassociate. Now a lot of us think, oh, disassociate, that's like multiple personality stuff. I don't do that. Well, guess what? Have you ever found yourself, you're probably going to do this in about 20 minutes, staring at the floor, like with your eyes glued into something, not blinking for 20 seconds. And your kids are like, Mom, hey, Mom, wake up. Are you here? That's what that is, guys. It's a tiny disassociation. So your brain kind of goes, I'm overwhelmed and I'm just going to shut down just a little bit. It feels great, right? So that's a disassociation. So start noticing, when do I disassociate, right? It's a fascinating conversation. Is it in times of high stress? Is it around your kids? Is it at work when there's chaos? Is it around turning on CNN? It's not a bad thing, but if we do it too much, and a lot of us believe that disassociation or freezing that's left offline, that goes too long, is sort of depression. So that's a lot of us, what we think freeze is. The freeze response is the dorsal vagal complex in the brain sort of shutting down because maybe these other things don't work, or maybe in your family of origin, it didn't make sense to get aggressive if things were stressful in your family. Maybe someone would get more angry and that wasn't safe. So maybe disassociating or freezing made more sense, right? Under functioning, those sorts of things. So this is, remember, your brain is a don't get killed machine. So it's purposeful to do all of these things to keep you safe, to avoid pain. But your brain is also making a lot of guesses, and it's not necessarily very helpful from a self-care standpoint and from a anxiety avoidance standpoint. This slide is really important. I share this with all my clinical social workers that I supervise. I share it with a lot of my clients that I work with. You've probably heard me use this term activation quite a bit. And I just want to be clear that what activation means is when your body gets kind of in fight, flight, or freeze mode. Okay, so that can be really subtle. That can be really aggressive. People that have had real big T trauma, veterans, they get activated when they hear fireworks or gunshots, right? Or people that have had trauma, violent trauma in their life, right? For me, I carried a pager for way too long. You show me a pager, my body gets activated. My armpits start sweating, my palms sweat, my eyes dilate. It's like my stomach drops down to my knees. It's fascinating. If I hear the beep, beep, beep of a pager, it's like that times 20, right? From being woken up in the middle of the night, so many nights, as a young baby social worker in my 20s, right? So that's activation. So this happens all the time when we get notifications on our phone, when we get pings of emails, when we hear certain sounds, smell things, taste, touch, all of those things are keying into our brain going, uh-oh, threat, potential threat, this has happened to you before, get alert, fight, flight, or freeze, right? So activation's a part of life. It's your stress hormone. It's meant to, chase you out of a cave, away from a tiger thousands of years ago to somewhere safe, okay? The problem now is that a lot of us are, instead of the activation happening and then it dips down and we hang out at baseline, which is what our bodies are supposed to be, which is just sort of like chilling out time, activation kind of stays up here all the time in our modern world because we're all tethered to these, because we don't turn off, we don't have any time off, we're getting email constantly, these sorts of things. So what's happening is we're having these real or perceived threats, our cortisol gets activated. And one little nod about cortisol, friends, and the reason I'm spending so much time is I'm kind of laying a groundwork today. So as I talk about self-care and how to be resilient when crisis happens, I'm going to be using this language that will make sense to you. Okay. So I know I'm heavy on this, and we'll fly through some other stuff here in a little bit. But when cortisol gets activated, again, it's meant to fight, flight, or freeze you out of a crisis. You're not supposed to hang out there all the time. So when we have long-term periods of cortisol activated, there's two things that happen in the body. The first one is that, this is the bad news. The bad news is that we get something called metabolic syndrome. You ever heard of that? So that's high blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, and one indication that we might be at risk for that is called belly fat. Now, all you perimenopause, premenopausal people, hold on tight. Low estrogen equals belly fat too. So it's not totally the whole story. But when our doctors see belly fat happening, BMI happening, worrisome, that is an indication that cortisol could be playing into this. When we start getting high risk for those metabolic syndrome issues, you need to ask yourself how much of stress is playing a role in my life, right? So that's one of the bad news is the metabolic syndrome. By the way, these all can be turned around. The other bad news is when cortisol is elevated in the brain too long, it causes inflammation in the brain. And an inflamed brain, from the research that we did at KU, at the KU Alzheimer's Disease Center, as well as Dr. Stephen Alardi's research out of KU Lawrence, who does a lot of depression research around the brain, he says that an inflamed brain is a depressed brain. So I know all of us, Eli Lilly has told us depression is a chemical imbalance. That's not actually accurate. What I believe is depression is not the fire, depression is the smoke, that something else is going on in there. Inflammation, cortisol, and the depression is the symptom of something bigger going on in there. So how do we lower this cortisol? This is the question of the year. Hello. Well, these are what the science says. So if you take nothing else from me today, I hope you take this from me today. And I want to say this sensitively. A lot of us can't leave our houses or maybe don't have the physical capacity to engage in all of this. There's lots of ways around this, okay? But the biggies that the research says is cardio. It is your number one way to lower cortisol. 3 times a week, you should probably write this down, 3 times a week, 30 minutes of getting your heart rate up, that it's hard for you to have a conversation, so you need to be breathing hard. Okay, that is antidepressant level of cardio. That lowers cortisol. So think about it. Think about it biologically. When that caveman hears the tiger, grabs their kids and runs 2 miles to another cave, guess what is lowering that stress hormone? It's the act of cardio. So it's like we're tricking our body saying, well, if I run, it goes, oh, the threat must be gone. Isn't that interesting? But it is the most efficient way to consistently keep cortisol down, okay? So whatever gets your heart rate up, doesn't have to be running, could be water aerobics, could be doing Zumba in your bedroom online, could be doing rigorous yoga. Sometimes you can get your heart rate up with that. Could be just walking rigorously with a friend. You really have to haul butt to do that, but you need to be having a hard time having a conversation. That is the antidepressant piece, okay? Yoga. Now, of course, I'm drinking the Kool-Aid here. I am not a new agey woo-woo person. Yoga for me is a very practical, I'm a runner and it keeps me out of injury. I will tell you that much, but it also helps my type A-ness. So yoga creates something called a theta brainwave activity. So here's the beauty of yoga. And I'm just going to finish with this piece and we're going to move on to the next slide. When I'm engaged in teaching yoga or I take yoga, and I'm engaged in a posture, pretend I'm doing chair posture. I am sitting in a chair, which is where I'm standing, but I'm sitting like I'm squatting down, like I'm about ready to sit. So I'm really engaged in a lot of leg work and my shoulders are engaged and my arms are engaged. And after a couple breaths, this starts really sucking. Like, I hate this. This was 20 years ago, Sally, right? New yogi Sally. And the old days, Sally would go, this sucks, this sucks, this sucks. Well, guess what was happening in my brain as I'm saying, because my body's getting stressed by being physically engaged. Then my brain goes into cortisol because I go, this sucks, this sucks, this sucks, because it believes it's in crisis. So yoga, after a couple of practices of yoga, instead of going, this sucks, a good yoga teacher says, okay, lower your shoulders. Take 3 belly breaths. Right? And so as I'm engaging in all of that, I am fully, sorry, my 6-year-old's knocking on the door. After I'm engaged in all of that, then I will sit down and then I will be able to release. And all of a sudden that cortisol has released the stress in my brain. Okay. So what that is powerful, right? So after I get stressed, then I am able to, when I'm standing in the DMV line next week and I think this sucks, instead of going right into this sucks, I can instantly go into belly breathing, right? That's the nice default that yoga does, is it starts changing neural pathways about what you default to. Primal scream, sobbing, cry, all of these things can be powerful in engaging in a release of the stress hormone. So in Norway, they have Primal Scream Day every month. I was a hospice social worker for many years. And I was always so annoyed at going to funerals and how everyone was like, be stoic, don't sob. And the research says the sob is the way that the cortisol is lowered, right? So that is powerful stuff. So remember the big T, little t. So when we do these things, now there's other things that lower cortisol. This isn't the whole story, but once those things are lowered, then we can come back to baseline and that cortisol is released. All right. Big T versus little t. No longer need to decipher that, both equally significant. Now, you're not going to get a PTSD diagnosis with little t, but little t traumas that are unvalidated, alone, isolated, in seasons where there's no hugging going on, no presence, no support, that's when we get at risk for little t trauma. And if that happens enough, we get depression, anxiety. Okay, so that's sort of the story of situational depression, right? I mean, we could throw COVID in that for sure. So there's other contributors to trauma. There's something called secondary traumatic stress. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Most of you probably aren't clinicians or social workers where you're hearing sad stories day in, day out like I am. But the reality is some of you may be very attuned to your news networks right now. And if you have any degree of anxiety going on in your life, I got to tell you, you got to shut that down. I have clients that they pay their 13-year-old grandson to basically shut down all the notifications on their phones, all the pings, all the lights, all the news notifications, and they just sort of stop for a month or two. The problem with all of this intake of bad news, which is what the news cycle only makes money off of, is getting your attention, right? Good news makes no money. So it's mostly bad news. So the more you get that in, the more your brain goes, the world is dangerous. And it has an undercurrent belief that the world is dangerous. And then the more that we believe that the world is dangerous, then guess what happens? Cortisol is elevated because it's in fight, flight, or stress. It's going, there could be a threat happen. So that's the problem. So a lot of my clients, a lot of the people that I work with, we do a trauma inventory. I say, what do you look at 6 a.m. when your alarm goes off? Is it your phone that has 20 notifications of the election and the Amber Alert? Are you watching Criminal Minds? CSI? How much trauma is your body getting in? We get immune to this, those of us that are in the field, and pretty soon we get numb to it if we're not careful. We hear sad stories and we feel nothing. That can be kind of a red alert that we need to be staying on top of our self-care more intensely. Now, keep in mind, whenever we're in these times of crisis, like COVID or political crises or medical crises, there's all sorts of normal versus destructive fears and emotions, right? Anxiety can well up, seize your mind. That's a very normal way. I've done a lot of work in cancer work and normalizing people with cancer. And our emotions show us what's important to us. You know, after we lose someone to death, and we feel terrible. And I think, why do I feel so terrible? Well, you feel so terrible because to the degree you needed that person, you love that person, that's the degree you grieve. By the way, here's a little side for grief and loss, because I do a lot of work around grief and loss. 7 years is considered a normal amount of time to deeply grieve something, and we would consider it normal, okay? So be kind to yourself. Don't expect people to bounce back. I mean, you can put them on Prozac or Paxil or Celexa and they might feel a little bit better, but grief is grief is grief. And as I alluded to earlier, a lot of us are experiencing this anticipatory grief. What is this COVID? What is this going to mean for the economy? What is this going to mean for my health? What is this going to mean for my family? I mean, there's just a lot of fear and anticipatory grief around that. So, excuse me. So, one of the issues around fear and depression is a lot of people want to feel better. first before they change their life. And I have to tell you, I'm a big behaviorist. In fact, with my clients that I work with, I tell them often that if you're not kind of willing to do some change in your life, then you're probably not a good match for me. Right? So there's a lot of time when we need to talk and validate and grieve and cry, and that's a big part of therapy. But sometimes we have to change our lives first, and then the emotions, excuse me, will follow. So that's something you need to be keeping in mind as you think about increasing your self-care, wanting to feel better about your life, those sorts of things. One of the things that we teach so much in resiliency is that thought containment, thought stopping can be really powerful. I don't know if you remember, I mean, almost 10 years ago, there was a man named Randy Pausch. He was on Oprah, and he was a big engineer for Disney. And, and he did this thing called The Last Lecture at Carnegie Mellon, where he talked about all the things that he had learned in his life. And unbeknownst to everyone else, he was dying of pancreatic cancer. And this was sort of his love letter to his young children and wife. And it was just this terribly powerful thing. And his wife, who's a young mother, she wrote a book about how she had to manage this time of living and being with him when knowing he was going to die, that she had these young children. And it was a powerful story. And one of the things that she talked about, Jay was her name, was this powerful idea of thought stopping. And I use this a lot with my clients who get into rumination loops. I'm sure none of you do this. I certainly don't. Where we start just kind of looping over and over. We chew our cud, just like a cow ruminates. In fact, in one of my old jobs, I had a cow that I would turn upside down, then go moo. And I would tell my clients, look at them, and I'd say, stop ruminating. By the way, you can do all sorts of things about depression. You can do cardio. You can change your diet, which does help, higher levels of omega-3s. More social support is antidepressant. Lots of more light, morning light is antidepressant. If you do all those things, but you don't stop rumination, it's really hard to kick depression. Rumination is a hallmark feature of depression, by the way, where we kind of obsess about things and we never kind of let them go. And it's our brain, right? It's trying to solve a problem that's actually unsolvable, right? So her technique was she would just get into these rumination loops, and Jay, this wife, and she would say, stop. And she would put a stop sign in front of her head and just almost like a visual stop sign and go, stop. And she would distract herself with something else. Okay. Sometimes sharing your anxiety with others. I do this a lot in the hospice world, and people that have terminal illnesses or coming to terms with their illnesses. And people, 20, 30 years ago, potentially your illness or cancer or other illnesses we didn't talk about them, right? And now I think we've learned that no, talk about it, share it with others, share that anxiety, right? The power of gratitude. In fact, gratitude is incredibly antidepressant because remember, your brain is a don't get killed machine. It wants to only remember the bad stuff that happens to you because that, evolutionary speaking, is the one thing that keeps people safe, is to not repeat the bad stuff. So remembering the great stuff that happens to you, great, wonderful. But from a brain perspective, your brain doesn't survive on that. It survives on remembering the bad stuff. So that's why a lot of my clients, a lot of us feel like kind of only bad stuff happens to us. And that's because our brain's like Velcro for bad stuff. It only wants to remember the bad stuff. Okay. People that have hope, that feel like there's something bigger in life above themselves, tend to show more resiliency. So this slide just sort of talks to what creates more resiliency in people. Normal versus destructive emotions. Feeling all of these things either around coming to terms with one's illness or even just getting through crisis. Abnormal, when we avoid, when we numb, when we look to things like suicide or drugs or denial. All of those things can be, as I lovingly refer to them, as maladaptive coping skills, right? So we're all on a spectrum of health around our coping skills. And hopefully in COVID, you've learned to kind of stay on the healthier side of coping skills, but we're all sort of on this spectrum, and you're in good company around that. Now, I've already alluded to this, that we're don't get killed machine. This slide really just normalizes anxiety, friends. I want you to be able to feel that the rumination, or that if you're like me and a recovering type A, where your brain is kind of always hypervigilant and it's hard for you to kind of calm yourself, or I'm the most type A yoga teacher that exists. I mean, please know, yoga does not come easy for me, but it's probably the one thing that I need to help me really relax and let go, right? So certain things endow us to that. So there's certainly a genetic vulnerability. In fact, what we believe from a genetic perspective is it's about 10% genetics that creates our health and mental health kind of trajectory or vulnerability, and 90% lifestyle. That's kind of shocking. From a chronic disease, mental health perspective, that is what the latest research says. 90% lifestyle, meaning how do we treat our bodies? How do we manage stress? How good are our boundaries? How many vacation days do we take? What kind of food are we eating, right? All of these things make us more vulnerable. Brené Brown, a fabulous researcher who does a lot of work on shame and vulnerability. It's kind of a brutal analogy, but I think it's a really effective analogy. She says that genetics, if you think about a gun analogy, genetics loads the gun, but environment pulls the trigger, right? So we may have breast cancer in our family. We may have bipolar in our family. We may have Parkinson's in our family or Alzheimer's disease in our family. But it doesn't always mean that it's going to genetically play out into our lives. It can be a genetic vulnerability, but what actually causes it to go live in our body is something called epigenetics. And it's kind of a fascinating look at the emotional and physical issues around. And so trauma, the environment we live in, all those things that I listed play into that. Sometimes it's just plain genetics. So I never want to say, oh, it's someone's fault because they get chronic disease. But we're certainly learning that autoimmune disorders, a lot of cancers, a lot of Parkinson's, a lot of Alzheimer's, some of them are age-related diseases, but a lot of them can be slowed, or the progression can be slowed, or the onset can be slowed based on lifestyle. Okay, so it may not mean that you don't get it, but you might be able to stave it off based on what you eat, okay? And a lot of things. All right, we already talked about this. And one of the things that I found so interesting as a therapist, and the first job I had at graduate school was in a partial hospital program in a community mental health center in Kansas City on the Missouri side. And so I would be doing group and individual therapy with people with bipolar, depression, and maybe they weren't bad enough to be in a psych hospital, but they were in crisis. So they were in our program during the day, seeing me, doing group individual therapy with me, an art therapist, a psychiatrist. They were doing a lot of intense work during the day to kind of get through a hard time. I actually think that PHPs, that's what they're called, partial hospital programs, or IOPs, which are like 3 hours a day, and intensive outpatient programs are kind of the best kept secret in mental health. They really work. And you may not think you're a group therapy person, but you'll be surprised about some of the data that I show you around trauma and how important presence and groups are. So keep up your support groups, friends, online support groups. It is imperative for trauma recovery, okay? But what I found is these people that had bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, which we believe are primarily biological disorders, right? Especially schizophrenia. Although there's some interesting research that came out about 10 years ago that said marijuana use can create an onset in schizophrenia where it might have been latent. So that's something to think about, even though it's becoming legal almost everywhere. Please tell your children to hold off till their frontal lobe is cooked, at least till 24, 25, because there's some real huge meta-analysis that came out about THC and schizophrenia onset, which was quite troubling to those of us in the field. So we just do not have enough data around marijuana to give the stamp of approval as far as legalizing it or using as a treatment. Canada is getting data now, so we will get more data in the next 5 to 10 years, but I would tread lightly on all of that for now. But one of the things that we realized is that when stress happened, we saw people cycle in their bipolar more. We saw people get more psychotic, even if they were on their antipsychotic meds, when there was this stressor in their life. It was fascinating, primarily a biological illness, but stress would create increase in symptomology. So stress is powerful in our mental health. And I like to say that long periods of time of caregiving, and this is a big conversation I have with a lot of Alzheimer's families, wives or husbands that are literally day in, day out providing the sole caregiving of someone with Alzheimer's or some other pretty intense chronic disease. and and they are worn out, and they're not accepting help, or they're not thinking about placement, or maybe they promised their loved one they would never place them, which, by the way, never promise anyone that you won't put them in a nursing home. You just never know. We were never meant to caregive by ourselves, friends. Okay, really important. But one of the things I tell them is long periods of time of high stress is like a slow drip of poison to our brains. And I say this with all the respect and love, because I know we have hard lives right now, but you have to be aware of that. Our bodies were never meant to caregive by ourselves. So we were never meant to caregive older adults all by ourselves. We were meant to live in multi-generational families, like Hispanic and African-American communities still mostly engage in, where there are 20 aunties and 10 cousins helping. So it is not all on one person. In the same breath, we were never meant to have babies all by ourselves. We were never meant to sit in a hospital room and have a baby and then come home and sit in our and nurse that baby by ourselves and listen and watch blogs and to learn how to do that. We were meant to have 20 aunties hanging around us and other moms to nurse our babies for us. And so I'm not surprised postpartum depression isn't happening. I'm not surprised that 75% of all caregivers of Alzheimer's meet criteria for clinical depression. We were never meant to do these by ourselves. Okay. So stress can play a large role. Okay, now that I've thoroughly depressed you, I'm going to spend the rest of my time giving you the good news. I'm going to give you the good news. I'm going to give you what gets people through hard times. I'm going to give you how do we be resilient when hard times get us. This is an idea of looking at pain right now that I think is going to be a little provocative to you. I borrowed this from an intervention that I mentioned earlier, acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. And ACT is an intervention that's very mindfulness based. It's very philosophical. It takes a lot to wrap your brain around it. Those of us that do ACT therapy, we have to get a lot of training in it. You have to read a lot of books around it. There's a book called The Happiness Trap that I highly recommend that gives a nice introduction to the idea of acceptance and commitment therapy. That's kind of for anyone. But one of the big pieces of acceptance and commitment therapy that is very helpful for anxiety, very helpful for addictions, very helpful for eating disorders, is we look at hardship and pain differently than the world, than American culture does, right? So we have been taught, especially our medical world has taught us that no one should feel pain, right? We have a little opiate issue. Isn't that interesting? Right? And I'm not saying people shouldn't feel pain. I'm not saying pain is good, but I will say that those of us in the ACT world would push back a little against that and go, maybe there's two types of pain. Maybe there's dirty pain, which is saying, I refuse to have pain. Have you ever felt this emotionally? Like, I don't want to feel this right now. I don't want to feel sad anymore. I don't want to feel anxious anymore, right? I'm feeling that right now. Versus clean emotional pain or clean physical pain. What if we looked at pain, emotional pain, physical pain, as the natural and automatic result of living life? In fact, ACT has an amazing chronic pain workbook. I highly recommend if chronic pain is a part of your life. If you Google acceptance and commitment therapy for pain, it's like a green cover workbook. It should come up for you. So this challenges a lot of this. I think about, our modern day contemplatives, right? So we have these like ideas around the Buddhas and the Christian mystics and the people out there that we think who go to these meditation retreats and they spend 6 hours meditating. I mean, hello, I'm never going to do that. I can barely spend 1 second meditating without thinking about my target list, right? Right? Do you hear me? And I think, I could never be that way. But after I got trained in mindfulness, I started looking around the world and I started realizing there's a lot of people that aren't mystics, that are practicing the skill of being able to harness their anxiety, contain it, and still be able to manage it and do what they need to do. I think about the U.S. gymnastics team. These are 14, 15, 16-year-old girls in the height of puberty. I don't know about you, but when I was 14, 15, 16, if my hair didn't curl right, I was like crying on the floor late for the bus and my mom would drag me to school. These are girls going out on a national stage with incredible amounts of pressure, probably feeling incredible amounts of emotional labileness, being able to perform and contain, manage. That is mindfulness, friends. So that is a skill. That is a skill that can be learned. So what does it mean for us to learn this sort of skill, right? So this whole idea of mindfulness is this ability to be in the moment, Now, see, Sally's brain is always out here, right? So I'm always thinking about the target list and what am I going to do with my kids while I'm doing this talk? Am I going to lock them in my closet? My husband was supposed to watch them, but apparently he didn't about 20 minutes ago because you heard them knocking on the door. What am I going to do with my dog? Right. So I'm always thinking ahead about life, or I'm thinking back here, oh, what should I have done differently at that talk? I should have gone to my church or somewhere where I could have been alone instead of being in the moment, right? So these are the problems, right? Is that we stay too much in the past or it's too much in the present, and then we are unable to be in the moment, and the future creates anxiety, the past creates depression, typically, if we stay there for a long time. So we work on mindfulness, which is a verb of constantly bringing yourself back to the present moment by imagining the leaves floating down a stream, or mindfulness of the breath, or mindfulness of the hand. And these are some things that we work on a little bit, right? So Marshall Lenehan, which is a prominent researcher out of the University of Washington, who created something called DBT, which I alluded to at the beginning, dialectical behavioral therapy. She's a well-respected psychologist and author, and she started doing research on the hardest of the hard populations. So the populations that were constantly in the ER for trying to commit suicide, almost kind of attention-seeking, manipulative behaviors, suicide behaviors, right? Those of us in community mental health, the ones that call us 700 times a day and need us all the time. Sometimes in mental health, we call them people with borderline personality disorder, right? They're chronically in crisis, often cutting or self-harming behaviors. They take a lot of people's energy in the mental health world. There's lots of legitimate reasons they have those diagnoses, by the way, often because of trauma, little t or big T. But one of the things, she did all this research in these hard populations, and she said, you know what, actually, a lot of these people are in crisis. So how do we teach these people to manage crisis, to get through crisis without making it worse? It doesn't mean they have to make it better, but how do they get through? And I thought, you know, this is what COVID is. I'm not going to make COVID better, but I do have to get through COVID without making it worse. I have to get through COVID without like damaging my kids or my marriage, right? Or my own personal emotional life. So these are some of the things that she taught that I think is so powerful for a lot of our clients, a lot of us. So how do we engage in distress tolerance, right? So if I have a flat tire, instead of going on the side of the road and falling on the ground and rolling around and crying, right? What would it mean for me to problem solve? So obviously we're going to problem solve, but sometimes we have problems that we can't problem solve. Sometimes we have myasthenia gravis, or we have Alzheimer's disease, or we have, we're losing someone to death in a nursing home and we can't go see them. We can't solve those problems. So what do we do if we've got a problem we can't solve? We have to cope. We have to self-soothe, or we have to distract. Now, not to be confused with avoid. Remember the avoiding numbing conversation? That's not good. You need to feel your feels. It's important. So how do we tolerate distressful things? How do we do that? Well, I take my clients, I have an index card, and on one side we put distracting coping skills, and we go through all sorts of things, and I'm going to give you a slide on this. And the other side of the index card, we do self-soothing coping skills. And this is all dialectical behavioral therapy. If those of you that are social workers or clinicians or anyone who needs CEUs, you might think about getting a DBT 3-hour CEU online, because this is nuts and bolts of good coping. Anyone can use this. And I did a lot of eating disorder trauma work. I worked in an eating disorder treatment facility and did trauma-based yoga with those populations, and as a therapist as well. And DBT was what we did day in, day out. When you feel like you're going to want to go purge, how do you self-soothe or distract yourself through that? Okay. Self-soothe, you use your sight, vision, hearing, smell, taste, touch. So on that index card, we would write down, okay, Sally, how do I soothe, right? My mom died of cancer 7 years ago. I had a toddler and I was pregnant and I was working part-time as a hospice social worker. I had to endure this high stress time. She was on hospice. I was visiting her. I was exhausted. I would feel great emotional swings during that season. And I was teaching DBT at the time. And I thought, man, thank God I know DBT. Every day I use DBT. And you know what I did? I thought to myself, how will I soothe myself with a vision? Okay, I'm going to go to Aldi and get a bouquet of flowers and I'm going to put it in my kitchen. going to spend that $3 looking at something beautiful. I'm going to listen to pop music that gets me in a nice mood instead of sad music. I'm going to have a smelly tea, like a chamomile tea or a peach tea, or light a candle, or do self-soothing essential oils when I'm struggling or feeling heightened emotions and I need to get through a time or be there for my 2-year-old, right? Right? Taste, be careful on this one. We like to do this too much in our country. Maybe a nice little candy to suck on, something like that. Touch. Now is the time, my friends, to get a cat, to get a dog, to get a rabbit, to get an Afghan that feels wonderful, that you can put on your lap. Touch. All of these things don't solve problems, but what they do is they bridge us through hard times. So when we self-soothe, it's coping skills 101. Okay. On the other side, distract. So how do we teach people to distract? Well, you distract with activities. You find something to do, puzzles, video games, read engrossing books, watch engrossing movies, contribute, volunteer. There's a lot of needs out there, friends. Take a lasagna to the gal down the street that's got COVID. Compare yourself to someone that has a worse lot than you. Use opposite emotion, right? So when I was driving to my mom's PET scans, almost losing my you-know-what, I knew I needed to distract myself with an opposite emotion. So guess what I did? I would get comedy CDs from the library, like Dave Barry or Dane Cook, and I would listen to comedy CDs the whole way there. So I was distracting myself. Now I still felt feel the feels, so that's important. I still cried. I still felt what I needed to feel. I didn't distract myself too much away from those experiences. So that's my plug for doing therapy, guys. Guys, I'm in therapy. I see my therapy weekly on Zoom and have for almost a year now. So we all need therapy. I have seasons of my life where I need to go back and revisit and work on some stuff in my own life. And for me, therapy is this time where I can let down. So that's where I feel the feels. And I have to tell you, every time before therapy, I go, I don't know why I do this. I have nothing to talk about. And then about 3 minutes into my therapy session, my therapist goes, how are you doing, Sally? And I go, I'm fine. And then I'm crying and sobbing and processing pain I had no idea needed to be processed. Okay. So when you give time and space to feel the feels, your body will show up. And that can be a wonderful outlet if you're not allowing yourself to have that outlet elsewhere in your life. If you're not crying with your friends or having times of letting down or being quiet, or having a faith experience where you have times to reach out to something bigger than yourself and to feel unconditional, whatever that is for you, that's my big hope that you would get into that. Pushing away other thoughts, other intense sensations, these can all be powerful. So emotional regulation, how do we modulate our own affect? How do we engage in this? We're going to do a little bit of this at the end. One of the pieces around yoga that I sort of alluded to when I talked about, remember old Sally when I did yoga and I would be in chair pose and I'd be going, this sucks. And then my yoga teacher would go, okay, Sally, release your shoulders down, release your jaw. And I want you to take 3 belly breaths. So inhale, fill your belly. Feel free to do this right now if you want. Exhale, let your belly deflate. Inhale, fill your belly. Exhale, let your belly deflate. So not only was I creating that neuropathway change that when I felt stress, I went into breath that slowed the cortisol. But the other beauty of this is there's something called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is in your brain. It's a massive artery nerve network that attaches to your brain, goes down your neck, and it attaches to every organ in your body. Friends, this is the mind-body connection. So this is why when you feel anxiety, you get IBS, or you feel anxiety, you get constipated, or you feel anxiety and your stomach hurts, or your throat tightens, or you start getting, your asthma gets bad. Okay. This is carrying messages. So when your body feels perceived or real trauma, right? Doesn't really matter. It can be either. It sends messages down. This is kind of the whole chronic illness autoimmune issue I was talking about, the 90% lifestyle, 10% genetics. trauma goes to the body first, and then it goes to the brain. So this is why we do yoga or a lot of body work with people who've had trauma, because we actually get the trauma out of the body. Restorative yoga can be marvelous for trauma. Okay, really yin yoga, lots of really calming, slow, really nurturing yoga. I've seen incredible amounts of trauma literally visibly leaving the body in people where talk therapy didn't work for 5 years. Okay, so that's it. But the vagus nerve, guess what changes the vagus nerve transmission? Breath. So when we breathe certain ways, so in yoga we do belly breath, or we do something called ujjayi breath, where we do a vibration of the vagus nerve. All of those things change the way that our vagus nerve transmits. So that's the good news. So when we change the way we breathe, all of a sudden this stress transmission changes, and it doesn't go into the rest of our body. Powerful, very powerful. That's where vagus nerve is involved in. All right, I'm going to see where we're at. We're a little behind. So I'm going to finish up here. So how can we support each other? I know there's a lot of staff members here. Is this shared emotion conversation really important? You alluded to me, I alluded to you that there is a researcher at KU Lawrence called Dr. Stephen Ilardi, and he's done all his researches on lifestyle change for depression. If you're intrigued by this idea of cardio or light or increasing your social support or increasing your omega-3s, if that is something that you have within your reach to do, get his book. It's called The Depression Cure. It is $3 used online. It is at the library, and it is on audio. And every one of my clients that has capacity to do lifestyle change, we read this book before we talk about doing medication for depression, if there is mild or moderate depression, okay? This is an important conversation in the mental health prevention world, okay? That's enough I'm gonna say on that. I hope you look into that. So what are the good ingredients for staying emotionally resilient in this time? Remember how I said my therapist knew exactly what to say, when to say it for me to open up. That is imperative. So if you're thinking about getting into therapy to process whatever's going on with you in COVID or your diagnosis or your caregiver stress, and not everyone has to do therapy. If you've got a support network that is robust, where you have a safe place to go to let down, then go for it. The most important piece, and those of you that are staff members loving on people with diagnoses, this is important. In trauma-informed care, the number one secret sauce for people to get better emotionally, physically, is to feel cared for and to feel safe. So that is why when you pick a therapist, you need to interview a couple people. After 15 minutes, you will know, is this my person or not? I did that. I was astounded at how many crappy therapists there were. I finally found my person, and I get her, she gets me. I feel like she genuinely cares for me. And because of that dynamic, I'm willing to make some change in my life. I'm willing to go out on a limb and be vulnerable and talk about patterns in my life that I need to change. That relationship is what does the good work, okay? Not necessarily the intervention. That's acceptance and commitment therapy, awesome. DBT, awesome. Psychoanalysis, awesome. Cognitive behavioral therapy, awesome. But it's really the relationship that is the most important. Once you have that rapport, then that intervention, there's different interventions that are good for people, but that's the most important. And that needs to be a joyful relationship. And a lot of us that have had trauma, our joy hemisphere in our brain is somewhat shut down because of fear, because of pain, because of woundedness. So how do we build capacity in people? COVID has been so hard on us, right? Politically, things have been so hard. How do we build capacity in people so that they can love again, so they can join into a therapeutic relationship again? Well, in group therapy, this is our number one thing we do with people with PTSD. We put them in group therapy. Face-to-face time with people who want to be with us and enjoy us is anti-traumatic. That's a bad word of saying it's trauma. It staves off trauma. Gratitude, talking about stories of past appreciation, of feeling connected, builds up the right hemisphere. So capacity is there so people can connect, right? So if you lead group therapy, think about doing activities where people go around and say, talk about a time when you had a wonderful Christmas or a good memory of a good birthday in the last 10 years. That creates warmth in the right hemisphere. It's fascinating. So that's some of the neurobiology of this. Second ingredient to stay resilient through trauma is first is good rapport, felt safety, connection. Second is self-regulation. This is mindfulness, guys, 101. This is an ability to say, when I'm in crisis, how do I self-soothe? How do I take 3 belly breaths? How do I tune in to a part of my body that can calm itself, that I don't need a Xanax or a glass of wine or a cigarette? I mean, we all got our spectrum, guys. And if that's you, don't feel bad. It is a hard time. But I'm just saying, every time I think about, oh, I need a glass of wine, I think, why do I need to medicate myself right now? Right? What do I need to feel? What do I need to press into? Right? That is a hard question to ask. Okay. So mindfulness is simply curious, non-judgmental acceptance of where we are. It does all sorts of benefits, mind, body, emotions. The third piece is some sort of resolution work. So this is my nod to trauma interventions like EMDR. There's something called somatic interventions, that somatic SEC certified people, somatic experiencing certified. These people, sometimes people have such physical manifestations of trauma or pain that they have to work through those physical manifestations. And that is called, there are people that specialize in that, therapists, and I'm seeing magic with those people. SEC, look for people like that. EMDR is great for people who have a single episode trauma. It's an eye movement work. There's lots of things that do that. But if someone's got some real profound trauma going on and there's been some seasons of real challenge, big T, you need to look into some of these things. Not all of us are going to need this. The fourth ingredient to being resilient through trauma is post-traumatic growth. It's for you to come out of COVID. This is what I hope I can say at some point, maybe this year or next year, when we're out of this season, and say, you know what? This was so hard and my kids were home more than I ever wanted them to be. But guess what? It forced me to read 2 parenting books. It forced me to get back into therapy, and it forced me to be a better parent and address some things that I was avoiding, right? So I hope you can say something like that about yourself right now. And I'm going to end with some of this. And if we have a little Q&A here, these last 5 minutes, we're welcome to do that. How do we stay emotionally resilient in our current world? This is the slide of the day, right? So this sort of takes, if you've been asleep this whole time, here's the one you need to pay attention to. Get antidepressant exercise and do it outside. The reason I say that is that's your fastest way to lower that cortisol, okay? 3 times a week, 30 minutes. That's what the Duke study that came out 20 years ago, massive study that said 3 times a week, 30 minutes of your heart rate up is equivalent to 25 to 50 milligrams of Zoloft, okay? So I'm not telling you to go off your meds, but I'm saying if you're looking down the long game and going, I want to lessen my reliance on medication, then I look into the Dr. Stephen Alardi's book, The Depression Cure. He will give specific protocol around this. I am a believer in this. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I think this is the only way I've been safe and okay as a therapist. Do it outside because of the sunshine factor, okay? Light is antidepressant within an hour or 2 of waking, ideally. Have as much FaceTime as you can with people that fill you up. Now, I get it. It's COVID. It's winter. This sucks. So Zoom happy hours, Zoom. I have friends that do Zoom planking sessions. They're weirdos. I would never do that. But they plank and they Zoom with their college friends for 10 minutes every day. All right. If you are open to going outside and socially distanced walking 8 feet with a mask or 6 feet, if you have that capacity and the health condition that you can do that, by all means do that. Or sitting outside 8 feet from each other and talking, okay? Presence is antidepressant and it helps mitigate trauma, okay? Group therapy, we want to mimic as much of that as we can. Protect sleep above all else. Most of you need 8 or 7 hours. Some of you can get away with 7. Those of you that are getting 4 or 5, you are like a drunk person at a Christmas party that doesn't know they're drunk. I'm sorry to tell you the bad news, but you are fooling yourself. Your brain is inflamed, and an inflamed brain is a depressed brain, okay? So always prioritize sleep. Once you get sleep going, then we work on the cardio and the rest of that. Start a mindfulness, meditation, yoga, prayer life, whatever is pairing slow movement with breath gets you those benefits that I talked about earlier, right? And a connection with something beyond ourselves. We knew that that was an ingredient to resiliency, right? Finding something beyond myself to find meaning in, right? The parenting, the picture around that. Okay. All right, friends, that was quick and dirty. I appreciate your patience. Sorry about the 6-year-old banging on the door and the dog barking. I'll open it up for any questions or anything else you'd like me to do. Before we do that, let's go ahead and do just one or two things. I told you a lot of hard stuff. I want to leave your brain in a good place. So just put your hand on your belly. Let's just take a big inhale through the nose and an exhale through the nose. Good. And then I'd like you to take one more inhale and exhale. All right, friends. Any questions? Anything come up through the chat?
Good morning, Sally. Thank you this is John Sand. I'm one of the longstanding board members, a neurologist, and presently secretary, and most of you out there kind of have put up with me in the past, but you haven't. But thank you for a very thorough and uplifting and forward-looking view at approaching a crisis. Now, as you know, many MG patients do not have the capacity to exercise in a very aerobic manner. And if you could reiterate the other ways to try to lower the cortisol, just to make sure that we have some approach to that for the patients that can't really exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. So that book, Depression Cure, that is just one ingredient. So I really hope that you engage in that book because it gives a whole kind of network. There's been some data that shows even like resistance training can create some equivalent to that, especially in men. And we've also seen that the yoga piece creates a similar theta brainwave activity as
something else, Michael?
As antidepressant exercise does. Okay. So if cardio is just not a thing, and I get it, then I would highly recommend that you engage in the yoga piece or find some sort of mind-body connection. So Tai Chi, Qigong, any of those slowed movement sort of those sorts of things can be almost equivalent from, in fact, Journal of American Medical Association came out and said an 8-week meditation program is equivalent to an antidepressant. Okay? Great book, 8-Minute Meditation. Highly recommend it by Victor Davich. 8 minutes every morning for 8 weeks gives you the data around an equivalent to an antidepressant. So cardio is about the same. Look into meditation, mindfulness. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. One more question. For compassion fatigue, how do we balance the trying to protect ourselves and trying to show empathy for others who need it? Do you have a couple of tips on that, please?
So how do we balance our own empathy? So I like to say that empathy is actually pretty exhausting because empathy tends to mean we're like a container. So we take people's pain, and for true empathy, you're going kind of down in the pit where they are. So you're having to tune in to maybe a time in your life where you've had intense pain. You're having to kind of come to terms with that. And that's hard. Nobody wants to do that, right? So a lot of us like to stand above the hole and like say, hey, can I give you a potluck? That sucks. It's a great Brené Brown metaphor that she uses. So empathy calls us to get down the pit. So that's really exhausting. So that's why a lot of people burn out. So one of the tips to going in the pit but being still okay is instead of being a container, you be something called a conduit. So a conduit is like pain comes through you, but you don't hold it. It comes out of you. So how does pain come out of you? Well, here's there's 2 tips, and you've heard them today. Good coping skills. And here's the biggie that you don't want to hear from me. Really good boundaries. So that means maybe you need to get into therapy and go, what does it mean for me to have good boundaries? Maybe no one in my family modeled good boundaries. There's a lot of social workers that have terrible boundaries. We give our cell phones to clients. We work all the time. We have every chronic illness. We drink Diet Coke for lunch and eat Snickers, and right? So what does it mean for me to take all my vacation? What does it mean for me to say, no, I'm done at 5? What does it mean to me to say, no, to things that maybe my ego wants to do, but I need to say no to for my own self-care. So that's a good conversation, good work, boundary work that creates that conduit. Yeah.
Thanks again, Sally, and thanks so much for spending your time and sharing your expertise with us.
Yeah, appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much.
Now we're going to take some time to let our industry partners give us some updates on their work, especially concerning myasthenia gravis. First, we're going to hear from Momenta on their work with the MG community.
My name's Jenny McHugh, and I head up patient advocacy and engagement at Momenta Pharmaceuticals, part of the Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies of Johnson & Johnson. Bringing together Momenta's groundbreaking science with Janssen's proven expertise in autoimmune diseases presents an unmatched opportunity to change people's lives for the better. And we are committed to doing that with you all, the MG community, and here today with MGA. We are so proud of our commitments and partnerships with MGA and the MG community. In science and research, we saw great advances earlier this year with our positive phase 2 data, and we look forward to our upcoming phase 3 clinical trial. Within overall wellness, we launched a series of wellness journals and resources that are focused on listening and learning from you all on how to make every day better when you live with MG. And we've spent a lot of time listening and learning from you in the MG community. And we were excited during MG Awareness Month to launch the Imagine My MG website. Done in partnership with the MG patient community, this site is focused on connecting you with others and providing resources to talk to your doctor and family members and how to live a better life with MG. We're so grateful to be a part of the MG community and to partner with the MGA. Enjoy the conference, and we look forward to talking to all of you soon.
Thank you. Now we're going to hear from Lonnie Kersey from ARJ Infusion Services. Lonnie?
Hello, everybody. It's, whoa, hey. I'm glad to be here with you all this morning. We do a lot of, most folks know who we are. We help a lot of folks with their in-home infusion services. So if you have a need or have any questions about home infusion services, of course, talk to your doctor first and make sure that that's something that he's comfortable with for you. But we are here to help you with anything you need. There are many treatments. We have some new stuff coming out, so this is a good, exciting time for those folks who might benefit from our services. So please, if there's any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I may not be able to answer them today, but it's just like I can probably lead you to the right place if you need. I want to thank everybody for having me here, and it's been a trying time, and I hope everybody's getting something from this because I know I have this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Lonnie. Next up, we have Dr. Konstantin Pharmakidis from the Department of Neurology at the University of Kansas Medical Center. He will give us an update on COVID-19 and myasthenia gravis. Dr. Pharmakidis was prior at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and is a neuromuscular specialist and a myasthenia gravis clinic physician at University of Kansas. We are honored and lucky to have him spend his time and expertise with us. Good morning, Dr. Pharmakidis.
Good morning, Dr. Sand. It's great to be here. So I am ready to go. Okay, all right. So good morning, everybody. This is, usually a time where I get to see some of the members of the myasthenia community outside of the office, and it's always so nice to get a chance to, interact outside of the clinic setting. And I will miss it this year, and as things are different in significant ways. But I'm very excited still to be able to present, via Zoom conference. And I think under other circumstances, I might have even been able to go to the studio where the rest of the MGA team is. But since I have exposures in the community, because of seeing patients, being in the hospital, having kids that are in school, and I also see patients that are higher risk, in the high risk group for COVID. I think it made more sense to sort of present in this way. So I also I can't see your faces as I might in sort of in a conventional setting, but I can also imagine that there might be some COVID fatigue, just because it seems like for the last 8 months, that's like all that's been going on. My thinking today is that I'd like to present about a number of different topics on COVID and try to keep things lively and I hope interesting. I will maybe, at the risk of stealing a little bit of my own thunder, I would like to mention that I think the message for MG patients with regards to COVID, and of course the disclaimer is so far, I think it's optimistic. I think it's positive so far. I'm pleased to be able to sort of say that I think there will be like some positive content here. After talking about MG, and there's a number of things there, I want to talk to you also about some research that I've done over the last couple of months since we started doing telehealth visits, in March of 2020, and specifically research on myasthenia gravis follow-up care done through telehealth. I want to tell you about it and also sort of invite to hear your opinions and feedback and ask you to contribute in the effort. There's also some other research that I'm involved in, and I'll briefly talk about that as well. In the end, I hope we have time for questions, and I look forward to, trying to answer them and interacting with all of you. So first of all, some disclosures. So I've participated in a medical advisory board for the first company listed over there. That's a company that is in the later stages of drug development. But this is not a drug that I'll be talking about today at all. I'm also a site principal investigator for a phase 3, so sort of like a late stage or final stage clinical trial for a drug that is similar to, is conceived to be very similar to eculizumab or Soliris. So yeah, my participation should be known. I'm very excited about participating in the study, and I'll tell you a little bit about that as well. Okay, so let's get started. So what you'll see here is basically what appears to have been, or I think what we know was sort of ground zero for this, once in a century pandemic. So in Wuhan, China, and I really don't have much familiarity with China at all, but it's apparently a sprawling town. It's in sort of the mainland of China. In the inside, it's a relatively big town. It has a couple of rivers, kind of like Kansas City, which is built around, our own Missouri and Kansas rivers. So this is what the town looks like. And let's see, let's advance. And what you'll see here is this red dot, which is where the Wuhan South China Seafood Wholesale Market is. And in November, December of 2019, a lot of people started having a very aggressive form of pneumonia. This type of market is a wet market. Of course, I think we have less familiarity with that over here, but basically in China, it's vegetables, fruit, seafood, sort of butcher, kind of like everything together. And there's also wildlife as well that may be slaughtered on the spot. And, the concept, the idea is that, some of the animals that are so fresh and sort of trafficked and sort of sold may be reservoirs for viruses that have the ability to skip from one species to another, to go from these other reservoir species to go to humans. And that jump is where this, this new syndrome, this new disease comes from. So, January 2020, that's when the virus started to spread and become sort of known around the world. This is a picture of the Wuhan wet seafood wholesale market. These are sort of representative pictures of these wet markets in Asia. This is not in Wuhan, but this is the seafood section. This is sort of the butcher block and sort of butcher stand. And then also this is some of the wildlife that gets sold as well. And okay, so what is COVID-19? So basically COVID-19 is coronavirus disease 2019. So coronavirus disease 19. It was a pneumonia outbreak that was detected in Wuhan and Hubei province in November and December of 2019. Chinese scientists were able to get some samples from inside the lungs, some of the fluid inside the lungs, and then they identified a novel coronavirus, which is, which is called the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and that's for severe acute respiratory syndrome. So very severe, very quick, and it's like respiratory, so a pneumonia, and it's a coronavirus, and it's number 2, because number 1 was the initial SARS back in 2002, 2003, which is, I remember it because I was a first-year medical student, and I was in Rochester, New York, and the virus came from Asia, but there was it was in Toronto as well, so very close to Rochester, New York. So I remember that very clearly. So by February, the Chinese scientists sort of published the genetic sequence, and from that we've developed sort of the gold standard diagnostic test based on RNA. It's like an RNA-based test. And the virus has spread all over the world and has been unbelievably impactful. Locally, internationally, economically, from a public health standpoint, and I think sort of from just changing and disrupting, day-to-day life, family life, school life. So what are the coronaviruses? So a family of viruses discovered in the 1960s. The viruses get their name from crown-like spikes. Let's see. The viruses get their name from crown-like spikes, which are seen in the image on the right side, the lower right side portion of your screen. These spikes are proteins that are sort of like lock and key. They're keys that are misidentified by human cells in the mouth, in the nose, in the eyes, and then they're misidentified as sort of something that may need to go into a human cell, and then the virus enters through this sort of deceptive strategy, and then uses the cellular machinery to reproduce and then start causing problems. So coronaviruses infect humans and animals, as we talked about, cattle, pigs, cats, bats, which are suspected but not proven for sure to be the reservoir of COVID-19. Interestingly, camels as well. As we've seen so vividly with COVID-19, the infection with coronaviruses can vary from no symptoms to just a common run-of-the-mill cold, and then of course the sort of devastating pneumonia that can be fatal. There's been previous coronavirus, outbreaks that have been serious. The SARS one in 2003, and then the MERS, which is the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which was in 2012. And I think the reservoir for that one was camels in the Middle East. Okay, so there's been discussion about comparing influenza and COVID, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Of course, when you talk about COVID is so new, and some of the studies that are required to outline some of these aspects of transmission and case fatality, it takes longer to figure them out. But this is sort of the information we have, and it may change, and it's not set in stone. So with influenza, which is the seasonal flu that everybody is so familiar with, the case fatality rate. So basically, for every diagnosed patient, you have to have a known case, not someone that just has the virus and it's not symptomatic. The number of deaths is basically 1 in 1,000, so 0.1%. For COVID, for recognized, cases, we believe that the death rate is the fatality rate is 2.3. The infection fatality rate, which is different, is that the denominator is the total number of patients that carry the virus that may not even have symptoms. So basically, it's going to be lower because it accounts for all the asymptomatic people. Is basically 5 in 10,000. whereas for COVID-19, instead of 5 in 10,000, it's about 10 to 20 times larger, so 50 to 100 per 10,000, okay? So case fatality about 23 times higher, and then the infection fatality rate about 10 to 20 times higher. Okay, so COVID in our region. So you've probably been seeing the headlines, but this is sort of a story of competing dynamics. You've been seeing that, the headlines, the sort of public health leadership in our area, describing how we continue to see COVID-19 rise nationally, regionally, and locally. COVID-19 hospital inpatient volumes, and I think people will find this interesting. And I'll say it again, and I'll say it slowly. So COVID-19 hospital inpatient volumes in the region are up, but they're much higher now than they were in April or March or May, or even July when there was that second wave. So things now are sort of more active in the hospital than they were when we were having these very sort of these restrictions. Of course, I mentioned competing dynamics. So, and this is the positive side. This is part of the positive side. While numbers are up and the virus seems to be basically like very widespread in Missouri and Kansas, the risk of dying from COVID-19 has decreased. And for example, like in the first studies in China, out of the people that went in the hospital, the death rate was 7%. In the U.S. early in the pandemic, the death rate was thought to be 2 to 3%. But now in the U.S., even when you account asymptomatic infections, the risk of death is less than 1%, like 0.65% is the estimate. So while the numbers are up, the lethality is down. Let me see here. So this is total confirmed Kansas cases in Kansas. We're at about, we're at 90,000. And some of you may have been present when I think I did a patient support group with MGA in early May. I think it was like the first week of May. And this is the red dot. And that's where we were in terms of total confirmed cases. This is total confirmed fatalities in Kansas. We're at 1,100. And in May, we were at like 120, 150. Total confirmed cases in Missouri, a very large number, 200,000. This is where we were. We were at just like maybe 7,000 or 8,000 back in May when I did the same talk, and then confirmed fatalities in Missouri, 3,100, and we were at 400 in May. What you'll see here with this arrow is that so the numbers are going up, but what's also I think from a public health standpoint concerning, and we're looking at fatalities here, the arrow shows you the slope. And I mean, you want the slope to be at least, flat. And what's happening here is that this is the slope over the summer, and this is the slope now. So the slope is actually going up. So, the rate of accumulating fatalities is going up, even though the disease is less dangerous per se, because the case fatality rate is lower, the community spread is so much higher that we're just having like an upward rise in numbers. And these, this is just like a wonderful, wonderful slide. And it comes from the CDC, and it has so much information. And I'll ask you to just kind of bear with me a little bit as I cover it for everyone, for a little bit of background as to, what's going on in the United States. And it gives you a lot of context. So this is mortality. So basically the risk of, the amount of death from pneumonia, influenza, and COVID, because all of these are sort of they all cause pneumonia and a pneumonia type of illness that can be fatal. So this is U.S. mortality, or U.S. sort of amount of death from pneumonia, influenza, and COVID-19 from 2017 until now. So come over, look at these yellow bumps, these yellow mountains here. So this is mortality from just influenza, number of influenza cases. So this is just, mortality from influenza in 2017, 2018. You can see there was more influenza, sort of a worse season, a worse influenza season, 2019, 2020. So this is influenza, the yellow bumps, and then the red bump year after year, 2017, 18, 19, and 20. The red line here is a combination of deaths or mortality from influenza and pneumonia. So you add that up, and this is the number of deaths, the percent deaths due to pneumonia and influenza. And then, of course, the blue stuff here is the number of COVID deaths, which is another form of pneumonia. So here, this red line, remember, is pneumonia, influenza, and COVID. So look at how different, this is where things were before COVID came, and this is after COVID arrived. And these are the combined deaths from pneumonia, COVID, and influenza. And this is where we are right now. But it just gives you context as to sort of what we've been dealing with in 17, 18, and 19, and then what happened in 2020. Okay, so this is another, this is probably the sort of like a very concerning aspect of the epidemic, and sort of a very dark one, is that if you look at hospitalization rates by sort of race and ethnicity in the United States, it's also like very, very uneven. This is from the CDC. And if you look at the hospitalizations, and hospitalizations track with mortality and death. So basically, in Hispanic, Latino communities, and then in the non-Hispanic Black communities, per the CDC, the rate of hospitalizations are like 400 per 100,000 at the 400 level. But then in the non-Hispanic white community, it is 100. So basically 4 times higher in these communities. So COVID has been serious, but also the burden of the disease has been very, very uneven in its distribution. So what are some community concerns going forward? And this is sort of, what do we think about today and the next few months? And this is for, Missouri and Kansas, truly our community. There's the risk for severe illness and death is higher in those with risk factors for COVID-19. In those that don't have risk factors, the risk is very low. So the concern here is sort of for more like the high risk individuals. The major risk factors are age, by far age, and male sex, and being overweight, obesity, and also some underlying medical conditions. So high risk for those community members. The other concern is that increasing hospital resources have been dedicated to COVID-19 over the, and this was of course the case in March and April, but even more so now. And the concern is that this may delay care for others in the community. For example, patients that need, a classic example is patients that need, not emergent, but extremely important cancer surgery. So it's not an emergency, it doesn't need to happen right now, but you don't want to have delays in care for other members of the community, and it's not COVID related. They don't have COVID, but they can't get the care that they need in a timely fashion. And then there's also concern about staff shortages, because there's been, across the region, there's been, more hospital employees that have had exposure to COVID-19. So other major concerns, and in the clinic, I see this a lot, and it's very, very real, is the accumulating effects of social isolation in the community. I have a number of patients that are, that they're in a nursing home, and they're sort of in a quarantine environment. They haven't seen their wives, for 5-6 months, and continued disruptions in schools, which may affect educational progress for our students. And that's sort of a major, major issue for the community. We talked about health outcome disparities, which are a source of very serious concern. And then also there's the economic disruption, which is, major, but also very uneven. It's not evenly felt in our community. And of course, there's this sort of cloud of uncertainty around November, December, and January, and what's going to be the public health sort of environment for those months. So this is a slide that I also had shared in May when I spoke, but it's such a interesting one that I just want to share it again. It's basically, it goes through like a case study. It's sort of like the the case study of social distancing in sort of flu pandemics. And it has shaped our thinking about how to approach, and the thinking of public health experts, how to approach management of a flu pandemic. So basically, this is in 1918, there was the Great Flu Pandemic, and this is the case of what happened in Philadelphia. And what you're seeing here on this axis is mortality, so deaths per 100,000 people. So in Philadelphia, the first case was in September of 1918, but they didn't start social distancing until October 3rd. So in those 2 weeks, the virus kind of spread everywhere. And then by the time they did the social distancing, it was too late. The virus had spread through the community, and then there was this huge surge of death over the next couple of weeks. And this is in contrast to sort of our own, sort of St. Louis, where, they had more warning. So the first case was on October 5th. And once they saw the first case, they didn't wait 2 weeks, but they did social distancing within 2 days. And they were able to bend the curve. And they didn't have this dramatic surge. And this is sort of what has driven the thinking around COVID-19. So, the idea about not having this big surge without precautions is that, health capacity in a health system only goes to a certain level, the number of ICU beds, healthcare staff. So you want to avoid having a surge, which is, what happened in New York City, what happened in Northern Italy, what happened in Spain, what happened in, some other parts of the US as well, where there were so many people in the hospital that the people that got in the hospital, it was like impossible for them to get optimal care. There just weren't enough beds. So basically, the hope is that if you are able to enact social distancing, the area under the curve, like the number of people that are going to get it might be similar, but it's going to be slower, and it's not going to stress schools. It's not going to stress hospitals. And, the hope is, that there are already better treatments for COVID than there were in March. And, soon, I hope there's going to be a vaccine. So if you have treatment and a vaccine, the number of people that would have gotten it at the tail end, maybe they never get it. So that's sort of the theory behind the stuff that, the public health interventions. Okay, so having introduced COVID-19, now we can talk about COVID-19 concerns in myasthenia gravis. Well, as many of you know, infections are thought to be the #1 precipitant of myasthenia gravis crisis. And by crisis or exacerbations, it's, when you have a worsening, when you need to go to the hospital. So the concern is, well, if there's COVID, could there be, more exacerbations in MG patients? Another major concern is, well, I'm on immunosuppressant medications, and, this is an infectious disease that, perhaps requires like a fully intact immune system to fend off. Am I at a higher risk? Another concern with COVID and MG is that, although I think this is less of a concern now because our treatments have advanced a lot, but what if you have some underlying respiratory weakness? So basically your breathing is not as good, you're not moving air as much. And patients that have respiratory weakness are known to have a greater risk for pneumonia, for a community-acquired pneumonia, for more severe cases. So, could it be that the respiratory weakness predisposes someone to have worse COVID-19? So we talked about infections, the most common precipitant for MG, immunosuppressant medications, and of course, underlying respiratory weakness. And then, if MG is a risk factor for severe COVID-19, what can I do to manage it? How does that get managed? So how do we investigate COVID-19 effects on myasthenia gravis? There's a number of things that you can do. And many of these things are ongoing. You can look at case reports that have started to come, that have started to be published over the last 6 to 8 months. You can look at, sort of group cases, so sort of cohort, basically case series of patients with COVID and in the setting of MG. You can look at registries basically registries or organized depositories where cases of MG and COVID are accumulated from all over the world. And this has been ongoing. I'll talk about that and what are some of the early conclusions from that. And then, myasthenia patients are not the only patients that frequently are on immunosuppression. There's transplant, organ transplant, patients that have a liver transplant or a kidney transplant, or there's patients that have other autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or psoriasis that are on immunosuppressive medication. So, and then of course, there's also the anecdotal experience that, we have in our clinic and in our community about what we've been seeing from our MG patients, where we follow, 100, 150 here at KU. Sorry. Okay, so we talked about studies of patients with other autoimmune diseases, registries of myasthenia gravis patients, and then of course, the gold standard would be to look at larger groups of patients and basically look forward and compare them with people that don't have myasthenia gravis, and sort of compare as you start looking forward whether the non-MG patients have a worse have worse cases of COVID-19. Okay, so case reports. So case reports, I have reviewed them, and I think there was a newsletter article about this. I'm not going to go into details of case reports because, you look at them and then there's every kind, just like myasthenia is a condition that it's almost like a snowflake. Every patient is a little bit different. Every case is a little bit different. There's pediatric myasthenia, there's adult onset myasthenia, in the teen years, there's, sort of myasthenia like late stage or late onset. There's all these different antibodies. Some people have thymoma. Same thing with COVID. Every case report looks quite different. And, if you look at the case reports, there's no clear, I think the takeaway is that there's no clear pattern that emerges about myasthenia and COVID-19. So this is what they are. And then data from other diseases. So first and foremost, data from other diseases. So the recovery trial was published in the summer of 2020. Actually, the other disease here is COVID-19 itself. And this was a very large study that was done in the United Kingdom. And what they did is that they gave 10 days of dexamethasone, fairly low dose. And they looked at, after they gave the dexamethasone, which is a steroid, just like the prednisone that some of you are familiar with, dexamethasone is a related drug. And then they looked at 28 days to see whether mortality was different, at 28 days for those that have had dexamethasone. And it turns out that mortality went from 26 to 23%. So, and they looked at very large numbers, like 4,000 patients in one group and 2,000 patients in the other group. So this is thought to be like a real, this is outside of the margin of error. So it looks like dexamethasone, or like a prednisone equivalent, reduces the mortality from COVID-19. So there's a study of immunosuppressive therapy in patients that have inflammatory diseases of the skin, things like psoriasis, for example. And this is a recently published study. And if you see here, sort of in the yellow orange print, patients were on azathioprine, which some of you are familiar with, methotrexate, same thing, Cellcept, cyclosporin, IVIG. And basically, the result there was that, they had no greater odds of being hospitalized, these patients that were on these medications, right? These patients with psoriasis, with the skin conditions, or requiring ventilation relative to the general population. And immunosuppressives, did not worsen the course of the disease after, correcting for other variables. Similar study about patients with arthritis, from a rheumatology clinic. psoriatic arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, psoriasis, inflammatory bowel disease, like Crohn's, and basically, again, they found a little more conflicting, but hospitalization rates similar in immune-mediated inflammatory disease, like these patients that were on these immunosuppressive medications and the general population. They did find that patient use of steroids and methotrexates was more frequent in patients that remained ambulatory. So maybe here they're saying that maybe the people that were on steroids on methotrexate was a little helpful because they were able to remain, they were able to stay outside of the hospital with COVID. Okay, so this is actually a very interesting sort of point of view on COVID-19 and coronaviruses and infectious diseases. And this comes from an article from an Italian liver transplantation physician, which has been quite influential. It's been cited very frequently in the medical literature. And the argument, and I think it's a compelling theory, I don't believe that it's proven yet, but it's a compelling theory. It is that it goes as follows. So coronaviruses, unlike the other sort of common viral agents, and these would be viruses that cause influenza, that cause the common cold, have not been shown, again, so coronaviruses like COVID-19 have not been shown to cause a more severe disease in immunosuppressed patients. And why might that be? Why might it be that immunosuppressed patients that need their immune system don't have, they don't have more severe disease? Let me do a time check. Okay, so just to try to stay on time. So maybe they don't, immunosuppressed patients, they don't have more severe disease. And the theory for that is that, and I think many of you may have heard this from the press, is that there's this understanding that part of the problem with COVID is not that the virus actually attacks the body, but it may be that the immune system overreacts and causes a very severe inflammatory response. And it's actually this overreaction to the virus that may be the main driver for tissue damage, but not so much the virus itself. So again, the host immune response appears to be the main driver of tissue damage during infection. So, more importantly, in looking at the mortality during the SARS 2002 epidemic and also the MERS epidemic, there's no evidence that there's increased fatalities reported in patients who are undergoing transplantation, chemotherapy, or immunosuppressive treatment. So again, just to kind of repeat this, because I think this is just sort of a key point of the presentation today, is that maybe coronaviruses, the problem with them is that they don't attack the body. It's just that they induce the body to attack itself. So if you're a little bit immunosuppressed, well, maybe that's good because you're not going to, your immune system is not going to attack your own body as much. And, the evidence showing that transplant patients, chemo patients, immunosuppressed patients don't have worse COVID certainly would support that. And then the risk factors, really, it's not so much immunosuppression, but the things that we've talked about: age, male, sex, obesity, diabetes, heart disease. So the KU neuromuscular experience, in our clinic so far, our patients seem to be, doing okay. We're not seeing more exacerbations, and we've discussed this as a group. And again, this may change. I don't know. And we're not seeing also exacerbations that are more severe in our patients. So, those are all positive things. So there's the myasthenia gravis COVID registry. So that is basically, let me just go back a second. So the registry is an organization of MG physicians that have put up a server, and then doctors from all around the world can go in there and report MG patients that have had COVID. And then the data will be compiled to see what kind of, what we can learn from it. So this registry, it's run out of Duke, and also sort of a multi-physician group, an investigator group. It looks at demographic data, so age, sex, no identifiable, nothing that can identify the patient, comorbid conditions like diabetes, obesity, renal disease, things like that, MG severity, COVID diagnosis, exactly what happened, and then the outcome. So that's the registry. It's ongoing. They have about 94 patients. Actually, I looked at that yesterday, they have 94 patients, laboratory positive. Here, I think, these are the numbers about, not recovered 5% or still recovering 5%, recovered 22, recovering 47, and then death 26%. I mean, that number is very high. I think even the people that are running the registry, they would say, no, I mean, we think there's a reporting bias. A lot of people that did fine are not going to be likely to show up in this registry that has patients that come from all over the world, from Russia, from the Middle East, from Africa, anywhere, the US, Canada. So I don't believe that's representative at this point. We can't say that. Okay, so this is some of the pandemic has sort of stimulated me to start doing some research on the role of telehealth in myasthenia. Before the pandemic, it wasn't possible to do telehealth visits with this. And when I say telehealth, I mean primarily these teleconferences through Zoom with video and audio. So you see, it's kind of like Star Trek, right? You see someone in your screen and you can talk to them. So that's sort of what telehealth means. Now, there was a lot of demand with the pandemic. Before that, we really didn't do it in neuromuscular disorders other than ALS. And, a lot of our patients here at KU, I mean, they travel from central Kansas, southeastern Kansas, southeastern Kansas, and then central Missouri and parts of Missouri. So some people have to travel significant distances. So the question was, what we learned from telehealth during COVID, could it help us develop like a reasonable plan for making telehealth available even after the COVID-19 era? So there may be potential benefits for providing follow-up care for MG patients beyond the pandemic. So what were the objectives for the study that I did? So compare sort of in-person, telephone, and video conferencing, these Zoom encounters. And this is like the number one thing that we looked at. I wanted to sort of see whether in-person visits versus telephone or Zoom made a difference in how likely you were to make management changes. We're always, as you all know, we're always trying to decrease patients' immunosuppressive medications, because they have side effects. So the lower we can get it and have the same result, the better it is. So I was wondering whether between these three different types of visits, there were different rates of making these consequential management changes. Looked at age to see whether certain ages preferred a type of clinic visit or type of visit. And the hypothesis there is that maybe patients that are older, they are not familiar with telehealth. That they just don't. It's just harder for them. Or distance. People that travel, they prefer to do telehealth. For patients that have a higher MG-ADL or disease activity score, if you're more active, you want to come in and you want to be seen. So these were the hypotheses. We looked at just the patients in our study. We've done patients up until the end of September, but I'm presenting data up until the middle of August, so 307 distinct clinic visits. I guess one of the main things to present here is that this is the change in immunosuppressant therapy. Okay, so I'm just kind of, again, so how likely were you to have a change in your immunosuppressant therapy? So no change was 80% for in-person visits. Telephone visits was the same, 80%. And Zoom was also 78, no real big difference there. But then what about increasing immunosuppressant if you need more? 13% in person, 7% telephone, Zoom around 12%, so fairly similar. And then of course, the very important one, if you're going to go down on, reduce immunosuppression, is it going to be different? Are you going to be more hesitant to do it as a physician if you don't get to see the person in person? So in person was 5% of the visits decreased. Telephone was 11%, so actually more for the telephone, and Zoom was 8%. So it doesn't look like in terms of stopping or decreasing immunosuppressant, that there was any difference between those visits. When you look at the total amount of care that's provided, the number of decisions, if you look at the chart, was the same. The median for in-person was 3, for telephone was 3, for Zoom was 3. This is a graph that shows, of course, that there's more of a range for the in-person visits. What's interesting here is that this is the early part of the pandemic, and this is Zoom. Please look at the blue line. So early on, everything went to Zoom, and then around June, everyone sort of said, I don't know. So we're not doing that much Zoom anymore, even though the pandemic is more active now than it was in June or April. So that's interesting. That may be telling about what patients, about the patient experience. And I will ask you, during the question and answers, during the discussion portion, to maybe chime in and just tell them, I'd love to hear about patients' experience with telehealth and how they compare it with, the usual in-person visits. So age by visit type, it looks like age was statistically significant. Older patients maybe did more telephone. And then, so that's sort of the main thing. They had a harder time with Zoom and maybe less in-person because of risk factors. And then distance. Did distance play a role? What looks like the median distance was a lot higher for Zoom, 62 miles, as opposed to telephone and in-person, which were 20 miles. So it looks like patients that were further away, they were more likely to choose to do a Zoom visit or like a telehealth visit. MG-ADL score was actually not significant. Patients that had a higher MG-ADL score were not more likely to do one visit type or the other. So more symptoms does not necessarily equal coming into the office. So study conclusions, both changes in the therapy, in the prednisone, for example, seem to not be affected by visit types. And sort of a concern was that the study was, okay, it showed us, what we do in the office, but it didn't show the patient perspective. How did patients perceive the benefits and the drawbacks of different types of visits? What was the patient's satisfaction, at the end of the visit between in-person in the office and Zoom? And, what is the role of barriers? Computing equipment, yeah, we have it in the office. It's provided by the medical center, and we have support staff that are able to and service and, sort of update the software. But that may not be the case for everybody in the community. So that may be a big issue for some of our patients. Okay. So vaccines. So again, sort of another exciting and positive sort of aspect of what we're going through. And I think something that is likely, there's no crystal ball, I don't know, but likely to be fruitful relatively soon. So vaccines aim to train the body to defend against a pathogen, against sort of, a virus, for example, without getting sick. So you're able to learn to fight it off without getting sick. So there's 6 different types. There's sort of a live attenuated virus. So basically you mutate it, you make it weaker, and then you infect the person with a weaker virus. So you learn how to fight off the stronger virus. The inactivated virus, where the virus is basically made unable to cause disease through radiation or chemicals or heat. And then you can take a protein that's like a signature protein of the virus, and then put it into someone, inject it, vaccinate someone, and then the immune system recognizes the protein, just the protein. And then when the virus comes in, the immune system is keyed in, go to the virus and clearly clear it out. Virus-like particles. So that's something similar, like a bigger sort of particle, not just a subunit, but that cannot it looks like the virus, but it can't do the whole thing because it doesn't have DNA and RNA, so it can't replicate. You can do DNA and RNA vaccines, which contain genetic material that then gets absorbed into the cells, and then the genetic material will sort of be used to produce things that look like COVID, and then teach the immune system to recognize COVID and fight it off. And then, okay, so currently there's 40 vaccines that have advanced the clinical trials, 40 in 7-8 months. And there's 240 in development. The source here is Reuters. They've been tabulating this, which is very helpful. Okay. Sorry, I'm also on call, so I'm just making sure that if I'm getting a message, it's not something that requires immediate attention. Okay, so there's 40 vaccines that have advanced to clinical trials. So you'll see here, the bars, the colored bars are the numbers that are in development, but the ones that are in a clinical trial where they're being, tried in humans are these smaller bars here. So here, 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 and here. By far, the most common type of model and platform is the protein subunit. So you take a little protein that, is characteristic for COVID and can be used to basically train the immune system, like training wheels. If you learn how to do this, then you can fight, if you learn to recognize this subunit, then you can fight off the real virus. So this is where we're at. It's very exciting, very hopeful. And I am sure that when the time comes, it's going to be looked at very carefully for safety. And, I think when it comes, it'll be a major step forward. So staying fit in the pandemic, I can't emphasize this enough. If you have more time because of the pandemic, maybe it's an opportunity to do more things to stay fit. Certainly being sedentary can be like a major, major drawback for community members, during these sort of restrictions that we deal with. These are just some suggestions: soup can, dumbbells, water bottles, indoor gardening. And this comes from an article that I read in sort of the regular press. Access to stairwells and doing stairs, doing stairs is wonderful. If you have them in your home and you can do them safely, do a couple of flights of stairs every day. Use a handrail, if that's something that's required, to make sure that you're doing exercise in a safe way. Walk during phone calls, stand up during commercial breaks. I think you've seen some of your physicians, they stand up when they are, when they're doing the visit. They're often like documenting on a computer. They're often standing up. Watch TV standing up. You can do wall squats, dips, countertop push-ups, virtual exercise classes. A lot of them, I understand, are free in the community. You can get online and yet something that's level appropriate. And many of them are geared to inexperienced or older community members. We can do dance video, more vigorous, Tai Chi, lower impact, but certainly, very important to try to avoid deconditioning. And if you have more time because of the pandemic, then maybe an opportunity. Okay, so take home points. Wash hands. I wear a mask, social distance. Try not to spread it. Try not to get it. And, it's also, you're doing something, my view is that you're also doing something for the community. You're doing something for the schools. So kids can go to school this winter, so that hospitals can function and people that need cancer surgery can get it in a timely way. So do it for you, do it for the community. If you contract COVID-19, know that MG is not clearly known to make it worse. It's not. There's no clear evidence indicating one should stop all immunosuppression. No, in fact, immunosuppression may be helpful. Don't forget that patient outcomes have improved significantly since the early part of the year, although the disease burden is brutally uneven. COVID-19 management in patients with MG is individualized. If you need IVIG, there's no reason you can't get IVIG. If you're on prednisone, you can probably stay on it. So it has to be individualized. There's no hard rules now. Try to stay fit and just know that there's like a global Manhattan Project for vaccines underway. And, maybe in 2021, we'll have an arrival. So I had sort of some things to talk about very briefly about the annual meeting. It's an opportunity to sort of just mention them. So at KU, we're involved in a phase 3 clinical trial. Phase 3 means late stage, meaning that phase 2, the drug has been tried for safety and it has advanced. There's evidence, that's promising evidence that it might be effective. So we have such a trial. I'm involved in it, and it's for a complement inhibitor. So something like eculizumab or Soliris. So if if someone has, significant, has disease activity, or they're on a lot of prednisone, and they want to try to be on less prednisone, and they're interested in participating, the trial is 12 weeks. There's a placebo for 12 weeks, but after that, there's an open label extension. So everybody after 12 weeks gets to have the drug. Let me know. You can send me an email and, or you can ask Allison or Tanya to make the connection. I'd love to hear about your experience with telemedicine. So during the question and answer portion, please feel free to let me know, what did you think of those visits? Were they productive? Did you like them? And then, if you want to participate in the COVID-19 registry, we're all, it's a team effort. All the MG physicians, we're trying to, get patients on the registry so that we can learn more and advance our knowledge about this. So thank you so much. I've probably gone on too long. Maybe we have time for questions. I really appreciate, being able to talk with you today. I miss not being able to sort of see you and see if maybe half of you are asleep. I hope that's not the case. And I think we're ready for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Pharmakidis. Thanks for a thorough and interesting and very relevant discussion of COVID-19 in MG. We do have some questions. Some of them are, well, some of them are mine. Okay, and in fact,
okay, I will do my best.
You answered at the end my first one, and that was what's new and what studies do you have going on at KU. So we're going to move on. Now, there was a question about certain blood types being more or less susceptible to COVID-19 infection. Do you have a little information on that for us, please?
Okay, that's a good question. I plan to mention this. Like, one of my disclosures, in addition to the stuff that's with industry, is that I am not an infectious disease doctor. So I'm not, and I don't. And when it comes to like treating COVID outside of what do you do with prednisone? What do you do with these other drugs that we use like azathioprine? I don't know. In my reading, I did review articles about sort of COVID in general. In sort of the standard, resources and reviews. I haven't seen something about that. If there's something specific, I invite you to, ask your primary doctor or look at a trusted site like the CDC. Although, again, I've reviewed their material and I haven't seen something on this. Okay, well, thank you. Now, many questions about vaccine for COVID-19 in MG. First of all, is it effective, especially if you're on immunosuppressive medication? And is there a risk to it? Or what is the risk? Okay. Is it greater than the normal population? Perfect. So, with vaccines, what we believe is that if you're on significant immunosuppression, and a benchmark would be more than 20 milligrams of prednisone daily, the vaccine, because of immunosuppression, the body is not going to be able to get as much of the benefit from the vaccine, to develop, the immune response, the immunogenicity, the response that you get from the vaccine, the learning that your immune system can do. If you're greater than 20 of prednisone, the effectiveness is likely to be reduced. So if someone were to, for example, practically speaking, if someone were to start prednisone because they need it, if we could get the vaccine in and then wait to start the prednisone 2 weeks later, that would be a plus. If we could lower the prednisone and work to do that and then give the vaccine, then the vaccine's probably going to be more effective. What about risks? So as you saw, the most common type of vaccine that is being developed was let's see here. It was the protein subunit, okay? So you see that here? So if it is a protein subunit, it doesn't matter if you're immune compromised because the protein is not enough if you get if you get the protein in your body to cause you to have COVID-19. The problem, if you're immune compromised, is if you get a live attenuated virus. Do you see that? So it's alive. If the virus is alive and you're immune compromised, you can get, the disease. But right now, there's none of these in the clinical trial phase. And everything seems to be protein subunit, viral vector, which doesn't have DNA, DNA RNA, which can't replicate, inactivated virus. So in terms of the risk, what you need to worry about in myasthenia is not so much that you're going to get COVID because it's going to reactivate, but maybe that you're not going to respond adequately to the vaccine if you're immunocompromised. And then the safety, you know, the overall safety, well, we don't have any safety information yet, but you can be sure that there's going to be a whole army of public health people that their whole life has been devoted to developing vaccines all around the world, you know, in all of the world's like major economies and major sort of scientific countries. And they're going to be, you know, looking to see how safe is a vaccine that's going to be given to billions of people. And they're not going to give it unless, you know, unless they feel confident that the upside is significantly greater than any downside.
Is there any information on the susceptibility to COVID or response to COVID, whether you're acetylcholine receptor antibody, MG, or MuSK, or any of the other, I mean, obviously more rare types?
So, I mean, that's a good question. There's been cases reported in MuSK. There's a case report that I saw over the last week, and I've seen a couple of times over the last couple of months. It's been out for a while. There's acetylcholine receptor antibody patients. As you know, MuSK is much less common than AChR. So if we're seeing fewer case reports of MuSK, it doesn't mean that you're less susceptible. So at this point, I haven't seen anything that would suggest that people that are AChR or, you know, LRP4, I mean, it's so rare, there's a particular susceptibility. Mm-mm.
And how much personal experience have you had in the hospital with COVID patients with MG? Can you maybe just talk about that a little bit, please?
Sure. So I think in our group, we have had three cases. One patient, maybe make that two. I think one patient just had it and they had it at home. They weren't hospitalized. And then, so they did okay. And then another patient had it, and I think, you know, they were hospitalized with an exacerbation, but this was not my patient. But the timing was such that it didn't seem clear that COVID had a role in the exacerbation.
Okay.
So very limited.
Well,
very limited, yeah.
Great. Now, the previous speaker had made some comment about reducing stress. One of the ways to reduce the endogenous, that is body-made cortisol in your body, which may increase the stress response, was to do aerobic exercise. If you could maybe, I realize it's probably a big topic, but kind of briefly talk about exercise in MG, please.
Sure. So, I mean, there's no, the way that I see it and discuss it with patients is that, you know, there's no specific evidence that, you know, myasthenia gravis is improved by exercise. You know, the problem is it's autoimmune, there's attack of the neuromuscular junction. But what we do know is that the benefit of exercise is overwhelming. It's overwhelming for heart health. It's overwhelming for blood vessel health. It's important for brain health and like dementia. It's important for mood and mental health. It's important for sleep. It's important for bone health. So basically, you know, the benefits are overwhelming of exercise. It should be age appropriate. It should be done in a way that does not put the patient, you know, the individual at risk of, you know, like more injury. It shouldn't be like dangerous types of exercise. So, you know, that's sort of a general statement that I would say about that. And then, of course, stress is bad. You know, it's cliche, but it's bad. It's bad for heart health. It's bad for it decreases your immune response. I think that's right. You know, if you're more stressed, you're more susceptible to viral infections. But I think COVID is different because if you're immunosuppressed, maybe you will mount less of a, exaggerated and self-harming response to it. So I think that's maybe more of a wash when it comes to stress for COVID, but stress is bad.
And I agree. I mean, for years, I've always wanted to write a prescription, you know, no stress or reduce stress, and unfortunately doesn't work that well. Thank you very much, Dr. Pharmakidis, for spending your Saturday morning with us with your expertise and sharing it with us. And gee, we look forward to keeping working with you in the future.
Sure, my pleasure. Is there are there any questions from the group? Is there are people able to get into Zoom and sort of share any of their perspectives about telemedicine or anything like that, or is that not something that's possible today? Or are we
no, that's what we were doing, Dr. Pharmakidis. These questions were coming from, a couple of them were from me, and most of them were from, you know, kind of put together. But we appreciate it.
Okay, very good. Have a good day, everyone. Take good care.
You too.
Bye
now. Next, we have a few more, some more information from our industry partners. We're going to start this time with Kathy Perez with argenx.
Good morning, everybody. I can't believe it's been a year since I was there with you. And I wanted to say thank you to Allison and to her team for putting together a 60th anniversary celebration meeting. I know they've worked really hard on that. A very special thank you to Jim and the tech team helping me through some technical difficulties, but that just is how things go. So I have a couple of slides to share with everyone. So the first slide is an introduction of something that the argenx team launched called MG United. And we did this during MG Awareness Month in June and really focused on a digital resource that shared information about the community. So used a lot of personal patient stories and also we hope to be serving up information for all of you that's really credible and helpful and hopeful. One of the things that we did was a project called My MG Soul. And if you take a few minutes and you visit mg-united.com, I think you might see some folks that you recognize from the MG community telling a bit about their story with MG. We are going to continue to partner with MGA and the entire patient community so that we're supporting all of you in the ways that are helpful, most especially during this COVID time. If you go to my next slide, I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware that we will be premiering a documentary for MG patients about MG patients and hopefully raising awareness in the entire community. The documentary is called A Mystery to Me, and on
Hi everyone, we had some technical issues with Kathy's phone dropping out, so I believe we're just going to go to the next presenter. I believe the next one is Amy, is that correct? Dr. Sand, do you want to introduce the next speaker?
Sure. It sounds like we may be able to get back with Kathy Perez and argenx in a few minutes, but now we're going to hear from Amy Grover with Catalyst, please. Amy?
Thank you so much, and I'm so excited to be here, and it's exciting that you know, we can take this event virtual, and I'm coming here from Southern California, so I'm sure everyone's spread out throughout the country. But hello, everyone. My name is Amy Grover, and I'm the Director of Advocacy at Catalyst Pharmaceuticals. I'm so thrilled to be here today on behalf of the entire team, and thank you, Allison, for inviting me here to speak. And congratulations to everyone at MGA. These times are challenging. And we commend you for your continued support of the MG community. And prior to my role here at Catalyst Pharmaceuticals, I was on the advocacy team for Global Genes, which is an advocacy organization for all 7,000 rare diseases. So these events are incredibly important education, you know, awareness for all 7,000 rare diseases. And I know, although everyone would love to be together in person, this is just fantastic that you all can still learn and to be educated. So congratulations, MGA. This is just fantastic. That is wonderful. But my role here at Catalyst is to be the voice of the patient community. And I build relationships and support organizations, and I love what I do. But we work with a disease called Lambert-Eaton myasthenic syndrome. And some of you may be aware of LEMS, otherwise known as LEMS. Some of you may not be aware of LEMS. And so what I'd like to do is in your little goodie bag, which this is great, Allison, there would be a flyer. And this is an overview of LEMS and MG and MuSK-MG. So take a look at it. LEMS is very similar to MuSK and very similar to MG. And so we'd like to, just get that education out there just in case you run across somebody that, because LEMS is most often misdiagnosed with MG. So take a look at that flyer. Allison has my contact info. And, if you have any questions and, just, contact me if you have any questions. But I'd also like to announce that yesterday we went live on a website called lemsaware.com. So if you want any more information, you can just type in lemsaware.com. It's a robust educational informational website that discusses all about LEMS. It does have some information on MG on there. So check it out. I recommend that you look at it. We're so excited. Just went live yesterday, so it's hot off the presses. But thank you so much again for having me here today. This is wonderful. This is fantastic. Although we can't connect in person, I know these events are, I'm a hugger, I love to hug. I know we can't do that anymore and we can't be together, but this is the next best thing. So again, congratulations. And thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you, Amy. Next, we're going to hear from Babak Borojurdi at UCB and the work that they are doing with MG.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm Babak Borojurdi. I'm a senior director at UCB. I'm a neurologist by training, and I am globally responsible for development projects with 2 compounds. I'm honored actually to discuss and to show you the design of our 2 phase 3 studies, which are currently ongoing. And I am based in Germany, so I'm 6 hours ahead of the Eastern time zone. So next slide, please. So the first study I want to talk about is the so-called RAISE study, which is a phase 3 study of zilucoplan. Zilucoplan is a C5 inhibitor, is a complement inhibitor, which is currently an investigational drug, which is in clinical development, has not been reviewed or approved by any regulatory agency anywhere in the world. This study is a multi-center randomized and double-blind placebo-controlled study. The aim is to confirm efficacy, safety, and tolerability of zilucoplan in subjects with generalized myasthenia gravis. And we anticipate about 130 participants who will be randomized in a 1:1 ratio to zilucoplan and placebo. This compound is given subcutaneously in a tiny subcutaneous injection, which is self-administered by the patients. The primary variable is the MG-ADL, myasthenia gravis activities of daily living. And the key secondary variable is QMG, quantitative myasthenia gravis score. And this study is blinded to participants, care providers, investigators, and the outcome assessors. And when participants complete RAISE, they're eligible to go into an open label extension study, the so-called RAISE-XT, and everybody in that study will receive the active drug, zilucoplan. And you see the schematic in the middle of the slide. So it's a 12-week study. The double-blind part is 12-week study, and it's followed up by an open label extension. In terms of who can participate, so subjects need to be, or patients need to be 18 to 75 years, obviously with a diagnosis of generalized myasthenia. And you have to have a positive serology for AChR, acetylcholine receptor antibody. You have to have a minimum MG-ADL score of at least 6 and a QMG score of at least 12. And it is allowed to have concomitant medications, for example, steroids or immunosuppressants. They just need to be stable at least 30 days prior to entering the study and through the course of these 3 months. So that is the requirement. In terms of who cannot participate, obviously healthy volunteers cannot participate, and anyone who had had a thymectomy within the last 12 months or is scheduled to have thymectomy during the study cannot participate. And the patients should not have a history of meningococcal disease or a current or a recent systemic infection within 2 weeks prior to baseline, or infections which actually require IV antibiotics within 4 weeks prior to baseline. So it's relatively easy inclusion criteria if you have generalized myasthenia gravis. Next slide, please. Okay. So the next slide. Okay. So the next study is a study with another compound, the so-called MG3 study, my caring study, with rozanolixizumab. Rozanolixizumab is a monoclonal antibody which actually reduces the amount of immunoglobulins in the blood. And similar to the previous compound, is in clinical development and has not received approval by any regulatory agency. This study is, again, a multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study. And the goal is to confirm the efficacy, safety, and tolerability of this compound in subjects with myasthenia gravis. The number of subjects is up to 240 participants. And these participants will be randomized to get active subcutaneous infusions of one of 2 doses of rozanolixizumab or placebo for 6 weeks. So that will be a weekly infusion. And there will be 8-week follow-up observation period. And after this period, for a duration of 52 weeks for a year, all patients will receive rozanolixizumab. The objective is to look at the primary variable change from baseline in MG-ADL, similar to the other study. And there are a range of different secondary variables. The key secondary variables similar to the other study is the so-called QMG, quantitative myasthenia gravis score. And we have other secondaries like myasthenia composite score, MG patient response outcomes, and responder rates, and activities of daily living. And you have the schematic of this study in the middle. So there will be a 1-to-1-to-1 randomization to 2 different doses of rozanolixizumab. Each of them will have 60 patients, and to placebo for 60 patients as well. There will be weekly weekly infusions for 6 weeks, followed by 8 weeks observation period, and followed by open label extension. In terms of who can participate, so adults, at least age of 18, obviously diagnosed of generalized myasthenia gravis, and patients should have a positive record of autoantibodies against acetylcholine receptor or a muscle-specific kinase, MuSK receptor, prior to entering the study. And there is a minimum requirement of MG-ADL of 3 or greater and a QMG of 11 or higher. So it's a little basically lower than the other study. And patients who complete this study, they can be randomized to an open label extension study, MG04, which and they will receive actually one of the 2 dose options of rozanolixizumab for up to 1 year. And during that open label extension, there won't be any placebo. Obviously, if needed, if there is a worsening of patients' symptoms, there will be option to exit the study and receive the so-called rescue therapy, for example, with plasma exchange, IVIG, or other drug, and that is allowed anytime during the study. That applies to the previous study. So that's the end of my brief presentation, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bourgeaud. We look forward to the results.
Me too. Thank you very much.
And next, we're going to hear from J.B. Smalley from Immunovant and to share an update.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. You can put up my first slide if you'd like. I'm J.B. Smalley. I'm the head of patient advocacy at Immunovant. We are relatively new kids on the block, so today I'll spend just a little bit of time talking about the company and what we're hoping to accomplish for myasthenia gravis patients. First of all, I would like to congratulate Allison and the team on a fabulous program this morning, and being able to deliver it in this virtual environment with flawless execution is obviously very important. So hats off to the team. You know, one of my roles at Immunovant is to help bring the patient voice into the organization and make sure that our teams, as we're moving through our development, understand the patient experience. And the MGA has been a wonderful partner in my early days here of helping to make sure that we can connect with many of you all and understand much about your daily lives and how you think about value, and how you also think about what kinds of outcomes you would like to see in myasthenia gravis. So I thank the MGA and Allison and the patient community for that. Can you put up my next slide, please? So Immunovant is a clinical biopharmaceutical company. We are in the early stages, and we have essentially a product in a pipeline. We have a humanized monoclonal antibody that targets neonatal FcRn. And what's unique about our product is we're hoping that we can bring it to market so it's available for self-administration in a subcutaneous injection, which is an injection under the skin. So if you send me to my next slide, please. Great. So actually, myasthenia gravis is where we are farther along than any of our other areas. We actually reported phase 2 data that was very positive a couple months back, and I know Allison had shared that with the patient community. And so we're very excited right now and putting a lot of effort into planning our phase 3 trial. And that trial is expected to initiate sometime within the first half of 2021. And you can see that we have several other programs underway at the moment. We have a program for thyroid eye disease that is currently still enrolling in phase 2, and another program for warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia that is also in phase 2 as well, and several NDAs that we're hoping to announce within the next 12 months. So that is our product within the pipeline. And we look forward to continuing our engagement with the MGA and working with the myasthenia gravis patient community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. We're looking forward to those results. Next and lastly, we'd like to have an update from Christine Rowe from Alexion. Christine?
Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. My name is Christine Rowe. I'm the Director of Patient Advocacy for Alexion. And I started my career in patient advocacy, about 17 years ago, when I also had a son with a rare disease who was born, and after circumcision, he wouldn't stop bleeding, so we knew that he had a rare disease. And you know, it's really been a great journey in being able to help families and patients who are affected with rare diseases, and really bringing the knowledge that I have had over the last few years to help patients navigate through their journey. So as I mentioned, I'm from Alexion, and one of our everyday inspirations is to really be guided. And our mission and our priority is always about patients, and especially those patients that we make therapies for. They're our guiding star. And we try to transform their lives through the development and delivery of innovative medicines, as well as through supportive technologies in healthcare. So could you go to the next slide, please? Every day, it certainly builds a better tomorrow. And you can see here, this is Jesse, who's actually living with MG. And, you know, if any of you might know Jesse from the audience, he's definitely an inspiration for us, and just listening to his journey and his story as to what he's gone through living with MG. And basically, it allows us to innovate and evolve into new areas where there's great unmet need and opportunity to help patients like yourselves and families live their best life. Next slide. And we're certainly doing our part to protect our own safety and the safety of those around us. You know, we've all been affected by COVID this year. We quickly pivoted to a virtual environment, much like the MG Association did as well, and we're happy to be able to connect with you in whatever way that we possibly can. It's always not that this certainly isn't the best way. We like to, meet people face to face and really get to know one another. But in the environment that we're living in, we want to make sure that everyone is safe. And we've done many things internally and externally to make sure that the patients and the employees, even at Alexion, are safe, and but we're still remaining true to our values. But thank you to Allison and the team for having us here today. We really appreciate it, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.
All right, well, welcome back, everybody. We're glad to see you all again. I just want to say a big thanks to Sally King, Dr. Pharmakidis, and all those helpful updates that several of you provided to the people that are listening today. It was all so valuable information. Thank you very much. We're just about to wrap up. We just have a couple of awards that we want to do. But before we do that, I want to say again, thank you so much to Distinctive Meetings. There's a group of people here that are social distancing that are pulling this thing off behind the scenes. They're just doing a fabulous job. And I can't end without thanking Allison, Tanya, Meredith, LaDonna, the team that pulled this whole event together. So much work went on behind the scenes that nobody gets to see, but we understand, those of us that are working on it. So thank you so much for all of your work and everybody else that put time into this event today. Okay, we've got, as I said, when I kicked off, we have 2 awards, the Stackhouse Award and our Volunteer of the Year Award. I want to do the first one. This is the Stackhouse Distinguished Service Award. This award is our most prestigious award to recognize outstanding leadership, dedication, and commitment, furthering the cause and supporting those affected by myasthenia gravis. It's presented to highlight the exemplary spirit of volunteerism and leadership. And it's named after Joan Stackhouse and her husband, the Reverend William Stackhouse, who were the founders of the Myasthenia Gravis Association. This year's award is being presented to the late Ray Olson. Ray served on the MGA Board of Directors for over 12 years. Not only was Ray faced with myasthenia gravis, but he was also living with Parkinson's disease. Many of you may recall Ray from support groups and events. He was a staple. Ray served the community in many facets, including at Indian Heights United Methodist Church and the board of directors at Crosslines. Ray was a man of strength and perseverance with a great wit. Ray succumbed to his battles on August 19th at the age of 83 at the Kansas City Hospice House. Ray embraced the mission of MGA, and his service will be greatly missed. Ray is survived by his wife of 56 years, Betsy, and their sons, Bill and Mark, and their families. The MGA is thrilled to present this honor to Ray's family, some who are watching the event today. Congratulations, and Ray, thank you for all you've done to support this and his family. We're so sorry for your loss.
Thank you, Michael. Our next award is our Volunteer of the Year Award. This year we are awarding the ATG Group, Christopher Bundy, Tessa Hyatt, and Graham Oxley. And they are joining us today to accept their award for Volunteers of the Year. The Advanced Technology Group, the Cognizant Company, is a leader in quote-to-cash solution services to both commercial and large enterprise brands, bringing contemporary boutique-style consulting to a global marketplace. The MGA is so fortunate to have Michael Egan on our board of directors, who is the VP of Operations and Marketing. During COVID, we took advantage of some of the downtime of staff to help us increase our marketing and overhaul our dinosaur database. With the help of Tessa, Graham, and Chris, we've been able to up our marketing, and we have a brand new database. So we could not appreciate their efforts more. Thank you so much. Congratulations.
We really appreciate it. Thank you for all the work you do as well.
Thank you, guys. So, as we wrap up today, we just want to say thank you to everybody who's attending virtually. Don't forget to check the calendar on our website of upcoming events. Specifically, we have our next virtual monthly meetup on Monday, November the 16th, with the topic of IVIG 101, presented by Holly McFarland of ARJ Infusion Services. If you'd like to attend, email the MGA office. Tanya can get you all set up. Also, don't forget, after today's meeting, you'll get a survey, and we'd love your feedback. So thank you for joining us this morning, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.